Chapter 1. The Eve of Light. St. Netherwell was the sort of village one didn't so much discover as quietly remember. Its narrow lanes coiling through folds of ancient green, hedgerows stitched like secrets into the soil, cottages with slate roofs bowing under the weight of years, and the impression, even to strangers, that time had made a pact with this place and rarely dared to interfere. A village held together by stone, silence and story. It was Candlemas Eve, and though the sky had surrendered to a soft grey by late afternoon, there was a kind of hush over the land that wasn't shaped by weather, but by something older, something ritual. You might say the village held its breath. Miss Marple arrived by invitation, of course, not by chance. A letter had come to her at St. Mary Mead in early January, penned in the careful hand of Beatrice Motton, the vicar's niece and former pupil of Miss Marple's dear friend at Cheltenham Ladies' College. A social visit, the letter claimed. Nothing urgent. Simply, would she care to spend Candlemas in the countryside, among old friends and fresh air? But the careful tone of the letter, the strangely formal phrasing, the absence of any mention of local diversions or ordinary cheer, those were the things that lingered between the lines. Miss Marple, who read people the way others read paperbacks, accepted at once. St. Netherwell's traditions ran deep. Candlemas, unlike the grander holidays, had its own more hushed ceremony, somewhere between folklore and obligation. Each household lit a single beeswax candle at dusk, placed it in their eastern window, and whispered the same phrase passed down for generations. The light wards off the old dark. We remember so we are not forgotten. They said, if you failed to light the candle, if the flame flickered out before dawn, there would be consequences. But no one truly spoke of those. Not directly. That was the nature of places like St. Netherwell. Certain things were understood, not explained. The villagers were kind, in the way villagers often are, with the sort of warmth that rests politely atop suspicion. They watched Miss Marple's arrival with expressions that didn't change, and voices that always dropped slightly when speaking of the occasion that drew them all together each year. They were preparing for Candlemas as if for a funeral and a feast combined. Wax was being poured, candles trimmed, bread baked with caraway. There were murmurs of someone new, someone who'd only arrived weeks before, but their names, like many other things, were not offered freely. She would have to earn them. Beatrice met her at the rectory gate. Lovely in the way only people unaware of their own beauty can be. Tall, linen blonde, wearing the sort of expression that seemed both hopeful and entirely resigned. She embraced Miss Marple too tightly for someone she hadn't seen in years. Her eyes were tired, not from sleeplessness, but from watching something she could not understand. Inside, the rectory smelled of wax, parchment and nutmeg. The vicar, Reverend Arthur Morton, was rehearsing a brief sermon by the hearth, eyes half closed, mouthing lines under his breath like a man half praying, half remembering. Miss Marple was shown to her room quickly, as if ceremony would shield them from discussion. That evening, as dusk approached and the church bell gave its singular low toll to mark the hour, each home began to light its candle. She watched them from her window, small fires dotting the village, glowing behind glass. No laughter, no music, only the sounds of footsteps on frozen stone and the low rustling of robes as figures moved toward the chapel for the procession. Each carried a candle and a piece of white linen embroidered with thread so old it seemed to shimmer without light. Beatrice appeared in the doorway with a candle of her own, held delicately in her hands like a relic. Her voice was even when she spoke. Some say the tradition is older than the chapel itself, she said, eyes lowered, older than Christianity. Before we asked for forgiveness, we begged not to be forgotten. Miss Marple nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on a child outside whose candle had gone out. No one stopped. The child relit it and joined the procession again, unnoticed. And what happens, Miss Marple asked gently, to those who forget? Beatrice didn't answer. She merely turned and left. As they made their way to the chapel, the procession gathered in silence, wax dripped to stone, flames swayed in the breeze. The night was windless, but a strange current moved among them, as if the very air shifted beneath their feet. A prayer was spoken, not by the vicar, but by a woman with an accent Miss Marple could not place, older than most, face pale as parchment, eyes hidden beneath a black lace veil. She recited from memory, in a voice that sounded memorized by the land itself, "Those who walk without flame shall wander without name. Light the candle, guard the door, forget not the ones who went before." Miss Marple studied the faces around her. Reverent, yes, but tense. There was no joy in the rite, only duty. And somewhere in the corner of her mind, a thought took shape. This was not about celebration. This was about fear. A quiet, orderly fear, passed from generation to generation like an heirloom, never discussed aloud, never named, but honored with the kind of seriousness only fear can maintain for centuries. She saw the village matron glance 3 times toward the forest. She saw the baker's wife clench the hand of her husband a little too tightly. She saw the postman mouth words without sound. There were no hymns, only silence and flickering flame. As they left the chapel, the procession broke apart naturally, returning to homes where candles continued to burn through windows. Miss Marple lingered outside a moment longer, drawn toward the small square near the well, where an iron ring had been driven into the stone centuries ago. Children whispered that it had once bound a woman to the earth for 7 days and 7 nights, though no one could say who or why. It had rusted through in places, but the ring was still there, still watched. The wind picked up, just slightly, carrying a scent of burning wax. Then, a scream. High, sharp, then cut off. It came from the edge of the woods, where no candlelight reached, and though the villagers froze, not one moved toward the sound, not even the vicar. Only Miss Marple stepped forward. But she did not enter the woods. She waited, and watched, because she understood better than anyone. Sometimes the most brutal truths begin not with answers, but with silence. For several long moments, nothing moved, not the congregation just dismissed from chapel, not the candle flames dancing in windows, not even the trees at the forest's edge. It was as if the scream had pressed pause on the whole of St. Netherwell, like the drawing of breath before a name is spoken. But no name came, only the returning hush. Miss Marple did not ask questions, not yet. She had learned long ago that in places like these, the truth arrived not when called, but when overheard. And so she returned to the rectory with Beatrice, whose face was unreadable now, save for the unmistakable tension in the set of her mouth. They walked without speaking. The fire in the drawing-room had gone out, though someone had stirred the coals before they left. There was a telegram on the hall table, unopened, its envelope creased, slightly damp, as though clutched tightly and then discarded. Miss Marple observed the postmark, 2 days old. She said nothing. That night, the candle in her window refused to burn straight. Its flame bent always to the left, though no draught entered the room. At precisely 3 minutes past midnight, the candle gave a sudden lurch and extinguished itself, without smoke, without warning. She lit it again. This time it lasted. She slept very little. In the morning, no mention of the scream appeared at breakfast. The vicar discussed the sermon he intended to deliver for Sunday, themes of light and tradition and humility. Beatrice asked after the garden at St. Mary Mead. Not one person referenced the noise that had, hours earlier, shaken the village to its spine, and yet the signs of its aftermath were there. 2 men were seen heading toward the forest at dawn, quietly, without dogs or rifles. A child cried when asked to fetch wood near the well, and refused to explain why. The baker's wife returned from the chapel with the hem of her dress damp and her candle basket empty. Miss Marple waited until after breakfast before rising. She made her way, gloves on, toward the square, and then down the path toward the woods where the scream had come. She wasn't the only one drawn there. Others lingered near their gates, watching without following. An older man, Mr. Elmore, the schoolteacher by her estimation, tipped his hat to her in a gesture both respectful and nervous. A patch of soil had been disturbed at the tree line. Shallow, not dug, but scraped by movement, shoes or something dragged. There were no footsteps leading away, just faint impressions, fading, and then nothing. She bent slowly to pick up what had been left just inside the trees. A candle stub, unlit, unused, its wick blackened but not spent. Nearby, tucked behind the exposed root of an ash tree, something softer, a shred of linen.
torn, white, embroidered with a delicate blue thread in a looping hand. It bore the faint scent of lavender soap and wax. The name stitched at the corner was Lydia Fern, a name unfamiliar to Miss Marple, but not to Beatrice, whose face changed when the cloth was shown to her later that morning, eyes narrowing first in recognition, then something more guarded. Fear, yes, but also memory. She works with her mother, Beatrice said carefully, at the candle shop. They live above it. Lydia's very quiet, keeps to herself mostly, reads strange things, writes things too. You know the sort. Miss Marple did know the sort. She also knew the ways in which villagers turned difference into suspicion with frightening ease. She didn't come to the procession last night, Beatrice added after a pause. No, she said she had the fever, but, Miss Marple prompted gently. She was seen by the old chapel just before nightfall, by the old wishing stone, alone. Miss Marple made no comment. She simply turned the linen over once more in her hand and tucked it away. In her experience, information offered tentatively often led to truths most people weren't ready to face. By afternoon the whispers had begun, not openly of course, but in the back aisles of the village shop, under breaths at the pump, and between lines of scripture in the chapel pews. They said the girl had gone missing before, that her mother had hidden it once already, that she had been caught speaking to someone in the forest, a man no one had seen clearly, that she had once written about old rites in the margins of borrowed books. The word vanished, passed between lips the way some use prayers, urgently, uncertainly, with the hope that saying it made it less true. Miss Marple visited the candle shop near dusk. It was quiet and dim, and smelled of beeswax and salt. Lydia's mother, Mrs. Fern, stood behind the counter, hands folded. Her face was pale, and not from worry, but from resolve. There were no questions, no welcomes, only a nod. Miss Marple asked for a tall candle, beeswax, hand poured. Mrs. Fern placed one on the counter. I hear Lydia wasn't at the chapel last night, Miss Marple said. She was unwell, the woman replied. Miss Marple let the silence grow between them, like ivy. Then she laid the linen down. Mrs. Fern did not react as expected. She neither gasped nor wept. Her expression did not crack. Only her hands tensed, gripping the edge of the counter, as if anchoring herself to something unsaid. She walks too much, thinks too much, she said at last. Sees things where there's nothing. I've known girls like that, Miss Marple replied. They often notice what others are too proud or too frightened to see. Mrs. Fern didn't answer. Miss Marple returned to the rectory just before dark. She placed the candle in the window, lit it, and watched it burn. The flame held steady this time, no flickering, no leaning, no unspoken message, and yet, from the path beyond the gate, footsteps, slow, careful, paused just long enough to be noticed. When she looked out, there was no one there, but the candle, ever so slightly, leaned left once more. The next morning arrived in layers. First the cold blue light that touched the window panes, then the creak of floorboards beneath careful footsteps, and finally, the faint toll of the chapel bell, though no service had been called. Miss Marple dressed in silence. The house felt heavier today, as if something once ambient had settled. She passed Beatrice in the corridor, shoulders tense, eyes flicking toward the front door as if expecting someone who might or might not arrive. She hasn't come back, Beatrice said quietly. Miss Marple paused. Lydia, a nod, and Mrs. Fern, she's closed the shop. There were no official statements, no constables, no noticeboard flyers, only the unspoken agreement among villagers that something had happened, and that to name it might be to invite it. And so they retreated into their homes, tended to their flames, and said nothing. At midday a visitor arrived at the rectory. A man in a charcoal coat, dark wool hat in hand, the sort one doesn't notice at first glance but cannot forget once seen. He introduced himself not as a friend of Lydia's but as someone interested in folklore and local rites, though his questions had less to do with Candlemas traditions and more to do with personal histories. Did she have beliefs, he asked, his eyes flicking toward Miss Marple. Superstitions, patterns of thought that might seem unusual. She was a teenager, Beatrice replied flatly. They're all unusual. The man smiled politely and left without asking further. Miss Marple noted the absence of any introduction, any credentials. No one asked for them. The next clue arrived not in the post but in the church itself. During evensong, the vicar paused halfway through his reading of the gospel, fumbled his passage, and closed the book altogether. His hands trembled slightly, not with infirmity, but restraint. "May the light of our Lord preserve what memory dares forget," he said instead. The phrase was not liturgical. It did not belong. After the service, Miss Marple remained behind, slipping quietly into the back chamber of the chapel, under the guise of observing the organ's restoration. What she found was far less musical. Behind the altar, beneath the choir's old platform, someone had placed 3 objects: a taper candle, entirely melted except for its unburnt wick, a ribbon of linen, torn from a sleeve, and propped carefully against the wall, a small leather-bound diary. Miss Marple opened it slowly. There were no names on the cover, no dates. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping, and at first glance neutral, but the words were not. "He's not a man, not in the way we are. He doesn't walk so much as a peer. He listens through the trees. The air thickens when he's close. I left the candle lit. I said the prayer, but the dark didn't care." Each entry was shorter than the last, as if the writer had begun to ration words. The final page was stained in one corner. Water, perhaps, or wax. It read only, "I saw the ring again." Miss Marple closed the book gently and left it where she had found it. There would be a time for it to be opened again, but not yet. That evening, the air took on a strange stillness once more. Children were kept indoors. Dogs barked at shadows. The bell did not toll, and across the village, several households were seen placing their candles, not in the window but on the threshold of their doors. An older custom. Protect defensive. Miss Marple lit hers as before, and once again she waited. At precisely 11 minutes past midnight, the flame flickered, not left, not right, but straight up, a sudden column of heat, as though fed by something unseen. It held for one breath, then returned to normal. From the forest path, the same footsteps, but this time they stopped at the gate, and this time they did not leave. No knock. She rose from her chair slowly, her back straight, and walked to the window. What she saw, or thought she saw, was a shape, faint as a smudge against the night, standing motionless by the garden wall, not quite facing the house, not quite turned away. Its proportions, wrong, as though someone had drawn a man from memory, but got the edges slightly blurred. A breath later, it was gone. The candle steadied. No wax had spilled, no smoke rose. She returned to her chair, but sleep would not come, because there was something about the air, an absence rather than a presence. It was the same feeling one gets in an empty room after someone has just left, the warmth still there, the scent still lingering, and the unsettling sense that perhaps they never left at all. The following morning, the well in the village square had been covered with a fresh wooden board. No announcement, no explanation. The ring beneath it, gone. The diary, also gone. Only Miss Marple remained composed, unmoved by the lack of explanation, because there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Where are you watching from, and what do you believe could bring justice to a girl who may have lit her candle and still vanished? If the questions draw you in deeper than the answers, subscribe. This investigation is only just beginning.
Chapter 2. The Missing Girl. There are moments in life where the absence of something weighs more heavily than its presence. When a door left ajar says more than one flung open. When silence lingers not as peace, but as a message unspoken. Such was the morning that followed the second Candlemas Eve in St. Netherwell, since Miss Marple's arrival. Though, as she would later reflect, the passage of time that night had felt more symbolic than real. The village had crossed a threshold. Yes, but into what, precisely, no one could quite name. The candle in Miss Marple's window had burned itself out cleanly, leaving behind a cup of golden wax and a small thread of ash that curled in on itself like a question mark. Outside, the air was still. The lane below her window was undisturbed. No carts, no footsteps, no early tradesmen. It was as if the entire village had entered into a pact of stillness, each household aware that something had shifted, yet unwilling to name it before someone else dared to. The gate was still unlatched. The figure she had seen at midnight, blurred, uncertain, still, had vanished before she could mark its features. Yet she had the distinct sense, as only those with age and instinct can have, that it had not left as much as stepped aside. The silence wasn't empty. It was watching. It was Beatrice who came to her first, pale, sleeves rolled, holding the edge of the morning paper, but reading none of it. Her eyes were distant, voice thinner than usual, almost cautious. "They've sent for her again," she said. Miss Marple looked up from her tea. "Who?" "Lydia Fern. The girl I mentioned, the one with the diary. She hasn't been home since Candlemas Eve." And there it was, spoken plainly, with no embellishment. A name, and a disappearance. The Ferns' candle shop, closed since the procession, remained shuttered. No morning smoke rose from the back chimney, and no deliveries were waiting outside. It was unnatural. The Ferns never closed, even on Sundays. In a village like St. Netherwell, disruption to routine was rarely tolerated, and never accidental. Miss Marple, walking the narrow path past the bakery and across the chapel square, saw the whispers before she heard them, shoulders leaning in, fingers twitching with intent, glances exchanged and quickly averted. A name passed between lips like a riddle, without a question. Lydia. She had vanished. There was no evidence, no struggle, no letter of farewell, only the absence of presence, a still burning candle found standing upright at the edge of the woods, its base perfectly melted into the earth. There were no footsteps, no marks of departure, and yet no one had seen her since the procession. A search was organized that morning, but it was cursory. The type of search meant more to satisfy curiosity than to find truth. 2 men, one younger, one older, both reluctant, they combed the forest's edge with walking sticks and muttered instructions, but their pace was slow and their expressions hollow. The truth was, they weren't looking for Lydia. They were hoping not to find her, because they had heard the stories, because they remembered what happened 40 years ago. That year, another girl, also 16, also the daughter of a candlemaker, had failed to return after Candlemas. She too had walked alone near the well after dusk. She too had been thoughtful, quiet, observant. And she too had vanished without a single trace, except for a wax figure discovered weeks later, placed gently at the foot of the altar, its features unmistakably hers. But even that tale, over time, had become wrapped in local caution and rural embellishment. It was spoken of as one might recall a strange weather pattern or a rare illness, not with terror, but with avoidance. The past, in St. Netherwell, was something to be kept behind the veil, and now Lydia had joined its ranks. The search ended with nothing declared. The vicar issued a soft prayer during morning matins. The postmaster brought no telegrams. Mrs. Fern did not open her shop, and yet a tension coiled under every doorstep like smoke, thin, ungraspable, and persistent. Miss Marple took a slow walk to the tree line, where the procession had ended and the candle had been discovered. The area was undisturbed. No footprints, not even her own from the night before. But something caught her attention nonetheless. A ribbon, faintly blue, barely visible against the moss and stone. It had been tied in a simple knot around a low branch, not loose, but deliberate. A signal, perhaps, or a marker, and directly beneath it, pressed flat into the mud but unsoiled by any step, was a small piece of folded paper. No name, no seal, just the unmistakable curl of a note meant to be seen, but not found. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside, one word, again. It was not an accusation, nor a warning, at least not in any direct sense. It was simply a word, singular, chosen, folded carefully, and left where only someone observant, someone looking for more than surface explanations might find it. Miss Marple turned the paper over between gloved fingers. No watermark, no signature, and yet the message resonated with such intimate certainty that it felt less like a discovery than a quiet confrontation. There was no doubt in her mind that the word was meant for someone who remembered. She returned to the rectory with the note tucked beneath her sleeve, and her thoughts as ever, perfectly ordered but never yet complete. Beatrice was pacing the corridor, glancing toward the doorway each time the wind shifted, as if expecting Lydia to walk through it with the calm ease of someone who had simply wandered too far and returned without consequence. But no such comfort presented itself. "She left something," Beatrice said suddenly, handing Miss Marple a worn journal with a navy ribbon wrapped tightly around its middle. "I found it in the alcove behind the shop when I went to look for Mrs. Fern."
Miss Marple took the object without a word, stepping quietly into the small study beside the drawing room. The book was modest in size and unremarkable in appearance, but the handwriting inside was unmistakably Lydia's, elegant, young, and yet measured. These were not random thoughts or scattered feelings. This was documentation. There were notes on Candlemas rites, references to older customs not found in parish books, diagrams of something called the Ring of Vanishing, and several translated passages from texts Miss Marple recognized as 17th century Romani folklore. It was obsessive, meticulous, and most curiously, paired with observations of villagers themselves. One entry read, "They all light their candles, but none of them know why. It's memory by repetition, not belief. They think it keeps them safe. I think it marks them." Another more recent, "Mrs. Cross stitched blue thread into my hem. She said it was for luck. I think it's for tracking." And near the final page, in handwriting more hurried than before, Lydia had scrawled, "I found the ring again. I stepped in. He didn't appear, but something did. It wasn't wind. It wasn't nothing." There was no date on that page, but Miss Marple could tell it had been written the day before Candlemas. She closed the journal, exhaled slowly, and considered the implications. Lydia hadn't merely vanished. She had gone seeking something. Not recklessly, but with intent. She had been documenting patterns, behaviors, symbols, not just the history of Candlemas, but something embedded within it, something possibly forgotten by most, but not by her. When Miss Marple asked Beatrice what the ring referred to, the girl hesitated. "There's an old field path," she said slowly, "beyond the ash grove. No one uses it now. There's a clearing, flat, perfectly round. Nothing grows inside it. And there are stones set into the ground, just beneath the soil. It's not marked on any maps. You'd miss it unless you knew what to feel for underfoot." That afternoon, despite the hour, Miss Marple walked the path alone. The wind had picked up slightly, not in gusts but in intermittent waves, like shallow breathing. Birds were still. The ash grove was silent. And then, just as Beatrice had described, she found it, a clearing, round, no flowers, no moss, only packed earth, and the faint glint of stone where the topsoil had worn thin. She stepped into it with caution. There was no sensation, no noise, but the stillness there was different. Not a lack of sound, but the presence of something watching the silence. She stood in the center for only a moment, and that was when she saw it. At the far edge of the trees, between branches and brush, a figure, unmoving, not hidden, but not fully visible either. The posture too straight to be accidental, the position too precise to be happenstance. No face, no features, just the silhouette of someone who did not want to be known, but very much wanted to be seen. Miss Marple turned to look more clearly, and it was gone. No footsteps, no rustling. She did not chase, she did not call. Instead, she knelt briefly at the center of the ring and pressed her palm flat to the earth. It was warm. The warmth beneath the earth lingered longer than it should have, and when Miss Marple withdrew her hand, she found no mark, no soot, no ash, only a faint shimmer of wax pressed into her palm, transient, fragile, yet enough to suggest that the ritual Lydia had studied, the place she had returned to, was not merely symbolic. Back at the rectory, dusk had returned with its now familiar rhythm. Windows glowed again with candlelight, but there was no sense of peace to be drawn from it. If anything, the flames flickered too wildly tonight, even where no wind touched them. Beatrice was in the study, seated beside the fireplace, flipping through the candlemaker's ledger, an old one, kept beneath the chapel organ's bench, filled with names, dates, and supply orders from decades past. "There's something strange here," she said quietly when Miss Marple entered. "Look at the last page." Miss Marple took the book gently. The entries for the most recent Candlemas orders were straightforward. Quantities, types, addresses. But the final line, entered in a different hand and ink far darker than the rest, read simply, "One candle, unnumbered, commissioned in silence, delivered to the woods." No signature, no initials, no date. Beatrice looked up. "Do you think she was the one who delivered it?" Miss Marple said nothing at first. She ran her finger along the edge of the page, then returned the ledger to its shelf. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps she was the one expected to retrieve it." They dined quietly that evening. The vicar was absent, away on a pastoral call he had not explained. The village had grown even quieter, as though it were waiting for news, but not from any official channel. There were no posters, no constables. Lydia's name had been removed from the school notice board, and yet her absence pressed in from all sides. The following morning, a woman knocked at the rectory gate. Miss Marple recognized her immediately as Mrs. Elspeth Carr, Lydia's former Latin tutor, retired, reclusive, and possessed of a temperament the villagers often mistook for coldness, when in fact it was merely precision. She held a parcel wrapped in brown paper, bound tightly with twine. "She left this for me," she said without preamble, "before Candlemas. Told me not to open it, unless she didn't return." Miss Marple nodded, and gestured her inside. The package was heavier than it looked. Inside, beneath layers of tissue and wax paper, were 3 objects. 1. A wooden matchbox, unused but scorched along one edge. 2. A silver pendant, shaped like a circle enclosing another, etched faintly with the Latin word memini. I remember. 4 girls stood in front of the old chapel, each holding a candle, each with a ribbon in her hair. Lydia was not among them, but Mrs. Fern, much younger, was. And there, standing off to the side, barely visible and half faded by time, was a 5th figure, male, older, hands behind his back, no candle, no ribbon, but unmistakably present. Miss Marple studied the faces. "Do you know the names of the other girls?" she asked. Mrs. Carr shook her head slowly. "No, only that 2 of them left the village within a year. One married a sailor, the other, I believe she was sent away. Her father was the blacksmith, and the 4th, drowned, in a wellspring not 20 yards from the ash grove." No reaction was visible on Miss Marple's face, but in her mind, the pieces began to move, quietly, cautiously, as if aware they had not yet been invited to fit together. That night, the candlelight in the rectory dimmed early. Miss Marple stood once again by the window, watching the edge of the woods. She had not spoken of the pendant. She had not shown the photograph to Beatrice. Some knowledge, she believed, worked best when left to gather silence before it was voiced. Just after midnight, as the bell in the chapel tower began its single solemn toll, the candle in the front window flared, not high, not wild, but with a steadiness that carried intention, and on the path below, illuminated for no more than 3 seconds, was a shoe, a girl's shoe, mud-stained, familiar, but there was no one attached to it. The candle dimmed, the bell stopped, and the shoe was gone. The next day, the chapel was locked. The vicar had left a note pinned to the parish door, for repairs. Miss Marple did not believe it, because the candle Lydia Fern left behind still burned in her absence, because the ledger listed no name for the last order, because the note in the woods read, "Again," and because 40 years ago, another girl had vanished without a sound. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 3, Shadows in Wax. The shoe, of course, had vanished by morning. Not taken, not misplaced, vanished. There were no marks, no soil trail, no indentation where it had been just hours before beneath the glow of the candlelight. Miss Marple had not called attention to it when she saw it. She had not moved quickly or allowed alarm to disrupt her observation. She had simply taken note, as was her way, for the quietest clues are often the most damning. At breakfast, no one spoke of Lydia. Not even Beatrice, whose usual melancholy had deepened into something more brittle, like a structure holding too much weight, silently nearing collapse. She stirred her tea 3 times clockwise, and said nothing of the news that hadn't come. There had been no return, no update, no knock at the gate, only the continued absence of a girl who should have been sitting in school, or walking the narrow paths with her journal in hand, or restocking candle moulds beside her mother. Instead, there was silence, and wax. It began, as such things often do in villages untouched by the distractions of modern inquiry, with whispers, first about the candle left at the edge of the woods, still burning long after the procession had ended, then about the ring of earth Miss Marple had visited, which by morning appeared untouched by weather or step, a ring that some said had been there since the plague years, and others claimed had been the site of an old dispute between midwives and clergy, long forgotten, but never forgiven. It was only after luncheon, when the clouds began to thicken, and the bells at the chapel rang unscheduled, that the first clue re-emerged. Miss Marple had decided to begin the day's inquiries not with the vicar, nor with Beatrice, but with Mrs. Fern. The mother of the vanished girl had remained, until now cloistered behind the wooden facade of the candle shop, her shutters drawn, her sign turned inward, but this morning the latch was unlocked, and the interior faintly lit. Miss Marple stepped inside without announcement. The room was dim, though hundreds of candles stood like silent witnesses upon every surface, some tall, others squat, all unsold. The scent of wax was heavy, but it was not unpleasant. It was memory, and beneath that, beneath the warmth of beeswax and the faintest trace of lavender, there was something more acrid, something faintly scorched. Mrs. Fern stood behind the counter, unmoving, eyes down. "You've come to ask," she said quietly, before Miss Marple had spoken a word. "I have," Miss Marple replied, with the calm grace of one who has never needed urgency to extract truth. "She's not here," the woman said, her voice neither grieving nor defensive, "and if she were, I wouldn't be the one to keep her from you." There was a pause, a long studied one. Miss Marple allowed it to settle, and then, as if remarking upon the weather, she added, "Your back room is sealed." Mrs. Fern's eyes flicked upward, only for a moment, then she turned. "There's nothing back there but old molds and unsent orders, things I haven't the heart to discard. Still," Miss Marple said, "I think I should like to see them." A hesitation, brief, sharp, then the woman moved, slowly, to unlock the door behind her. The key she used was old and darkened from years of use, far too worn for something untouched. The door creaked as it opened, but not with disuse, with resistance. The room was narrow, lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of wax forms, busts, tapers, ceremonial rods, half-sculpted figures waiting for detail. But at the far end, resting upon a low altar of stone, was one form quite unlike the others. It was melted, clearly so, but there was still structure in it, still shape, and beneath the damage, the droop, the pooling of wax at the base, was a face, faint, delicate, familiar. Lydia, the wax figure though incomplete, bore the unmistakable contours of the missing girl, not in the grotesque fashion of parody or folklore, but in something more intimate, more precise. The eyebrows, the curl of the lip, the slope of the chin, it was her, or it had been, and now it had melted into something that whispered not remembrance, but intention. Miss Marple did not move closer. She did not need to. "Who made this?" she asked softly. Mrs. Fern did not answer. Outside, someone passed the window too quickly to be casual, too quiet to be intrusive. The figure was gone by the time Miss Marple turned, but the wax remained, and with it, a legacy of silence. Miss Marple left the candle shop without comment, but with everything she needed. She did not need Mrs. Fern's confirmation. The wax figure had spoken clearly enough, and in the language of rage, not loud or uncontrolled, but precise. Rage can be a silent thing, especially when poured slowly, drop by drop into ritual. Outside the air had shifted again, not in temperature but in tone. Doors were closed that were usually ajar. Curtains fluttered slightly though there was no wind, and across the square at the corner near the well, 3 women stood in quiet proximity, speaking without speaking, their eyes moving toward Miss Marple and away again with the rhythm of practiced avoidance. There were whispers now, about curses, about Candlemas, about what was owed, and what had been delayed too long. Someone had told someone that the figure in the wax room was not the only one, that others had been made, though never shown, that each had melted within hours, except Lydia's, that it had lasted. In the chapel, the stone altar had been cleared unexpectedly for restoration. No one had requested it. The vicar had issued no statement. But when Miss Marple passed through the nave on her way to examine the old vestry records, she noticed the absence of the candlesticks that usually flanked the cross, and in their place, though removed hastily, carelessly, was a small round impression on the stone, about the size of a wax base, slightly burned. She asked Beatrice later if Lydia had ever sculpted. Beatrice nodded, then hesitated. She had a way with likenesses, she said. She once made a small bust of Mr. Elmore, the old teacher, gave it to him on Founder's Day. It looked more like him than his portrait. And what of molds? Miss Marple asked. Did she make her own? She said the shop's molds weren't good enough, that they captured shape, not presence. Miss Marple made a note of it.
There was something brewing, not in the modern sense of scandal or petty gossip, but in the ancient way, secrets exposed, not by confession, but by refusal to remain hidden. In the days that followed, more villagers came forward, always indirectly, always through implication. Mrs. Granger mentioned offhandedly that Lydia once asked about records of baptisms prior to 1900. Why she wanted them, no one knew. Mrs. Elmore said Lydia had once drawn the old chapel floor plan from memory after a single visit and placed 3 wax symbols over the southern pews. They were removed before anyone else saw them. The baker's apprentice claimed she saw Lydia speaking to someone in the graveyard 2 weeks before Candlemas, but there was no one there when she looked again. Then came the drawings. Beatrice, leafing through Lydia's belongings in private, found a folio tucked behind the dresser. Some simple, others uncomfortably detailed. One showed the chapel, exact, right down to the chipped stone and the weathered scripture over the door. Another showed the inside of the candle shop's sealed room, shelves, a work table, and at the center, a wax figure missing its face, and then a page torn in half but still decipherable, a hand reaching out of flame, holding a pendant with 2 circles etched in its center. Miss Marple recognized it at once. It was the same symbol as the pendant found in Lydia's parcel to Mrs. Carr. The sketches were not fantasy, they were record, which meant one of 2 things. Either Lydia had foreseen what would happen, or she had planned it. Miss Marple kept this thought to herself. That night, the vicar returned to the rectory with unusual haste. He declined supper, declined conversation, spoke only once. "They've begun blaming each other," he said. "I heard it in the post office. Words like curse and payment. They think she, Lydia, was chosen." "For what?" Miss Marple asked gently. The vicar stared at the candle burning between them. "I don't know," he said, "but they're speaking of it as though it's always been true." Just before bed, Miss Marple checked the wax in her window. Its flame flickered sharply, just once. She thought nothing of it, until she turned back the coverlet of her bed, and found a figure, small, delicately sculpted, made entirely of wax. It lay precisely on the pillow, facing her, its features unmistakable, hers. There are gestures in life meant to warn, and others meant to wound, but the placement of a wax effigy made in one's likeness, positioned where the head lays in rest, belongs to a third category altogether. It is the quiet declaration of knowledge, not mere familiarity. No, this was personal, deliberate, crafted with a precision that spoke not only of ability, but of access. The effigy had her chin, her cheekbones, the slope of her nose, and most disturbingly of all, the exact shape of the brooch she had worn on Candlemas Eve, molded at the figure's throat in miniature detail. Not guessed, observed. Miss Marple did not gasp, she did not flinch, she simply wrapped the figure in her shawl, carried it gently to her bureau, and placed it upright beneath the oil lamp. She studied it in silence for nearly 10 minutes, noting the way the wax had not softened despite the warmth of the bed. This was no remnant left over from forgotten ceremony. It had been placed there recently, and with intent. The candle on the nightstand burned without flicker. No windows had been left open. There had been no sounds of entry, and yet someone had come in. She rang no alarm. She roused no one. Instead, she sat by the figure, allowing the hours to pass like chapters unspoken, watching the flame beside her begin to gutter low. The next morning, she found Beatrice already awake. Her hands were inked from fresh notes, the pages before her marked with names of villagers, tradespeople, families who had remained in St. Netherwell through each of the Candlemas traditions going back 50 years. "I'm trying to remember who was here the last time a girl went missing," Beatrice said, her voice strained but controlled. "They say it happened once before, maybe twice, but I can't find anything written. No parish records, nothing in the archives. They wouldn't have recorded it," Miss Marple said calmly, setting the wax figure gently on the table between them. "Some things are remembered not in writing, but in repetition." Beatrice recoiled slightly at the sight of the figure, but did not cry out. "That's you," she whispered. "Yes, who would? That's what we're going to discover." Outside, the village was no longer hiding its suspicion behind politeness. Doors opened only to known faces. conversations halted when Beatrice approached the post office. The vicar's morning service had been attended by only 6 people, and none had remained afterward. Miss Marple walked among them unnoticed, or rather deliberately unacknowledged. People knew, or worse they believed, it was that evening, in the dim sanctuary of the chapel vestry, that the next piece revealed itself. Miss Marple had returned to examine the floor, specifically the base of the altar where she had once seen the faint burn, now cleaned. A stray thought had returned to her from Lydia's diary, where she had written of a wax figure discovered behind the altar, not near it. With careful movement, Miss Marple pressed against the wooden panel backing the altar stand, and found a narrow gap, just wide enough for a small form, and inside, half crumbled and caked with dust, was another wax figure. But this one was older, brittle, darkened with time. The face had eroded, but the dress had not. It bore the style of the late 1930s. The bodice, embroidered with a single wax rosette, matched an old photograph Miss Marple had seen earlier. One of the girls who stood with Mrs. Fern outside the chapel in the photograph Lydia had kept in her parcel. This was not new. This had happened before, and just beneath the figure, half buried in dust, was a scrap of wax-stiffened linen. It bore the same family embroidery, blue thread, looped at the edge. Fern, Lydia's grandmother. A pattern was forming. Miss Marple returned to the rectory quietly. She spoke nothing of what she had found, not yet, because the pattern was not complete. Not until the motive was made clear, but that night, as she folded the wax figure of herself back into the shawl, and tucked it into the wardrobe, she saw something on its surface that had not been there before. A thin crack, just at the base of the neck, and leaking from it, just a pin-sized bead, was red. She touched it gently. Not wax, not paint, crimson. She looked back at the candle in her window. It flared once, then steadied. Someone has placed a wax effigy of Miss Marple in her bed. Another, older effigy is discovered hidden in the chapel, suggesting Lydia's disappearance echoes a much deeper ritual legacy. And the newest wax figure bleeds.
Chapter 4. The Vanishing Ring. There are moments in which silence tightens, not as absence but as assertion, when what is not said ceases to feel passive and instead takes on the quality of intent. That morning, in the small guest chamber of the rectory, Miss Marple held the wax effigy in her hand and watched as the faint bead of red, no longer wax nor pigment, gathered at its fractured neck like a whispered accusation left just long enough to stain. She did not ask who had placed it. She asked herself instead who had meant for her to see it. Because in St. Netherwell, no gesture was without ancestry. Even fear had its inheritance. She placed the figure beneath a glass bowl on the dresser and left it there upright, like an unspoken question no one was yet prepared to answer. The candle in the window remained steady this time, though the flame leaned slightly right, as if beckoning. Downstairs, Beatrice was already dressed and hunched over a stack of Lydia's school papers, tracing pencil annotations with a finger. She looked up without surprise. "Something's happening to the others," she said. "The villagers. They're speaking in fragments, avoiding the chapel. Someone painted a ring on the ground behind the smithy last night, 3 circles, all joined." Miss Marple blinked once. "Widdowsins," she said softly. Beatrice frowned. "You know it. I've heard the term in other villages, Devon once, in reference to a ritual older than Candlemas. The path walked counterclockwise around 3 circles, usually burned into the ground, meant to bind the spirit of the past to the witness of the present. It was said to invite remembrance, but only from those willing to see what others forget." Beatrice's expression tightened. "Lydia spoke of that," she murmured. "In her drawings, in her notes, she called it the Ring of Memory. She believed it wasn't just a symbol. She said something watched from inside it." Miss Marple stood in thought. It was not merely the history that interested her, but the placement. "Behind the smithy," she said. "That's near the ash grove, is it not? And near the field path she walked most frequently before her absence." Another nod. Miss Marple left the rectory within the hour. The air had a strange weight to it, not from the weather, but from perception. Doors that had once opened with routine now hesitated. Children's games were no longer played at the square. Even the sound of the bell from the chapel tower felt slower, more muted, as if the bell had begun to question the sound it was meant to carry. Behind the smithy, as Beatrice had said, the ring had been marked, 3 distinct circles, faintly scorched into the ground, not by fire, but by pressure. Grass had not burned, but flattened in such a deliberate curve that it could not be natural. At the centre of the circles, something had been placed, a stone bowl, empty but stained. Wax, perhaps, or something harder to name. Miss Marple did not step inside the rings. She stood at their edge and observed, and it was from that distance that she noticed a slip of paper caught in the low branches of a hedgerow, hanging like a forgotten telegram. She retrieved it carefully. The image was a photograph, faded, black and white, slightly torn along one edge, but intact. Lydia, smiling, candid, mid-laughter as though caught unaware. Her hand rested on something, or rather someone, out of frame, but just behind her shoulder, unmistakable even in the grain of poor film, was a man's hand, broad, slightly veined, resting on her shoulder in a gesture that suggested possession more than protection. The rest of the figure had been cut away, whether by framing or intention, Miss Marple could not say, but she knew instinctively this was no relative, not the vicar, not a teacher, not a peer, someone else, someone the village had failed to remember, or perhaps chosen to forget. She turned the photograph over. A date was scrawled on the back in Lydia's own handwriting, January 28, the day before Candlemas Eve, and below it, one word, unseen. Miss Marple placed the photograph inside her bag, wrapped in a linen cloth. Later that evening, when she returned to the rectory, the glass bowl covering the wax effigy had fogged over with condensation. She lifted it carefully. The crack in the effigy's neck had widened. A line now crossed the brow, and across the chest, barely visible in wax, a circle had been etched. Not 1, 3. There are gestures that reach beyond the material, small marks, left deliberately that bypass explanation and go straight to the marrow of meaning. Miss Marple understood this. The 3 circles freshly etched into the chest of the wax figure were not a byproduct of heat or movement. They had been made, deliberately, since she had left it, and though no one had entered the room and the windows remained locked, the marks were there, just the same, quiet, unwavering, intentional. That morning, the postmistress, a woman of habit and little taste for imagination, delivered an envelope with no return address. It was sealed with wax, an old custom now uncommon, and bore only the initials CW. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, not modern paper, but something older, almost brittle. On it, a hand-drawn diagram, 3 circles, joined at their edges, and in the centre, a symbol she had seen before, 2 concentric rings enclosing the word Meminai. Beneath the sketch, in faded ink, were 3 names. None were Lydia's, but one belonged to a girl who had vanished in 1947. Another was a name Beatrice had mentioned once, in passing, Helen Wren, who had moved to the coast shortly after the war, but no one had written to her since. The 3rd name, Miss Marple recognised with grim clarity, Rosalind Fern, Lydia's grandmother. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the archives behind the chapel, a locked, dust-laden room whose catalogue of parish records, land rights, and family registers had not been touched in over a decade. The vicar granted her access without resistance. He seemed these days eager for others to search in his place. There, among pages browned by time and damp, she found the 1947 Candlemas register. 4 girls had been confirmed that week, 2 had been baptized the year prior, and handwritten in the margin beside one entry were 3 unnumbered notations. Ritual verified, circle unbroken, 3rd observed by unknown, no signature, no explanation, but in the margin of that same page there was a pressed flower, blackened, preserved by force of habit perhaps, or meaning, pressed into the brittle paper with just enough force to scar it. Outside the clouds were low. The wind, so rarely disruptive in St. Netherwell, began to churn the trees near the ash grove. As Miss Marple stepped from the chapel doors, she saw 2 men hauling timber toward the clearing where the Widdersham ring had been found days prior. She approached quietly, asking no questions at first. They acknowledged her with subtle nods but continued working.
placing wooden stakes at each intersection of the ring's border. "We're reinforcing the ground," one said without meeting her eye, "to stop it spreading." "Spreading," she repeated. He paused, the circles grown. She knelt, carefully examining the outermost edge. Indeed, a faint scorched trace extended now half a foot wider than before, smooth, unbroken, symmetrical. "This is new?" she asked. He nodded. "Since yesterday. Miss Fern, Lydia's mother, said it's always happened like that." Miss Marple tilted her head. "She's seen it before?" No reply, only the tightening of the man's mouth and the clear instruction in his silence that no further questions would be entertained. That evening, in the rectory study, Miss Marple lit a fire and sat beside it with Lydia's photograph still in hand. She had studied it many times now, and though the man's full figure was cropped, the hand, its veins, its ring finger bare, the shape of the nail beds remained vivid. She took out a magnifying glass. At the base of the thumb, something minute, a scar, crescent-shaped, just beneath the knuckle. Later, she searched through Lydia's diary once again, not for entries but for visual clues. Folded between the pages, barely held in place, was a second photo torn from the same series. This one showed only the man, profile blurred, face turned away, but unmistakably present, and this time the backdrop was clearer. A stone path, ivy-covered wall, and in the corner of the frame, a weathered plaque bearing the inscription, "Ashmere School for Girls, Esther 1863. Miss Marple closed the book slowly. Ashmere had shut its doors 15 years ago, but in 1947, it was operating, and its last recorded groundskeeper had been a man named Clive Wren. The same initials on the envelope. A brother, perhaps, a husband, or something altogether more complex. And somewhere in the midst of this, Lydia had found the thread. It is often the case in villages such as St. Netherwell that history does not rest quietly in archives or graveyards, but walks beside the living, disguised as habit. Miss Marple had spent her life deciphering such disguises, reading the facade of ordinary life for what it obscured, family tensions, community compromises and, in the rarest and most dangerous instances, legacy. And now, it was becoming clear that this legacy had been preserved not through reverence, but repetition. The Widdershire ring was growing. The villagers were watching it, though none said so aloud, and the name Clive Wren had returned, uninvited, but not unconnected. At supper, Miss Marple asked Beatrice whether the name meant anything to her. The girl had just taken a sip of soup and set her spoon down slowly, as if bracing for something long avoided. "My mother used to say it," she said finally, but only when she was frightened. Frightened of what? Beatrice looked toward the window. The dark, not the absence of light, but the dark in places where there should have been none. She said when we were children, that if we ever saw the circles appear, 3, exactly touching like chain links, we were never to step inside. That it wasn't the ritual that bound you, it was what watched you during it. Miss Marple did not speak. She allowed the girl's words to breathe, and in doing so, noticed something new, a reflection in the window glass behind them. A face, not their own, not peering in, but turned ever so slightly, listening. She stood and walked quietly to the pane, but there was no one outside. Only the distant sound of branches in the grove and the faint clinking of a lantern swaying on the chapel's porch. After Beatrice had gone to bed, Miss Marple returned to the study. The wax effigy remained on the table, though a thin line had appeared around its base, as if it had been lifted, then set down again, ever so gently. She examined the crack again. It had extended across the collarbone. The red stain had dried, but beneath it, barely visible, was a new line etched into the wax, a curve, intersecting the chest, a crescent, identical to the scar she had seen on the hand in Lydia's photograph. That night, she visited the candle shop one final time. Mrs. Fern answered the door without expression. "I have no answers for you," she said plainly. "I'm not asking for answers," Miss Marple replied. "I'm asking for the memory." There was a pause, and then, to her quiet surprise, the older woman stepped aside. Inside, the smell of wax was heavier now, less clean. There were boxes stacked along the back wall, molds set to cool, but in the corner, beneath a draped sheet, was something clearly shaped like a chest. Mrs. Fern lifted the sheet. A trunk, oak, iron clasped. Inside, photographs, parchment, ribbons, prayer cards. At the very bottom, folded in oilcloth and bound with red twine, was a book, not a diary, nor a Bible, a ledger. Inside, columns of names, dates, symbols, and beside each entry a mark, either a circle, a line, or a cross. Many were blank, others bore only initials, but 3 names were repeated: Lydia Fern, Rosalind Fern, Helen Wren. Only 2 had circles. Lydia's row was marked with a cross, no explanation, just an annotation beside it, written in the same faded ink. Stepped inside, unseen, witnessed, awaiting response. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spine of the book, and beneath it, tucked into the seam of the trunk, one final object, a photograph, the Vanishing ring, burned into the earth, 3 girls standing within it, one of them smiling, one looking away, and the third blurred, not from motion, but from absence. It had not been captured, it had refused to be. Miss Marple left the shop without a word. That night, just past midnight, she returned to the clearing behind the smithy. The ring was wider now, the wooden stakes had split, and at the center, something new, a candle, lit, standing upright, with a ribbon tied at its base, blue thread, looped, and beside it, a second candle, unlit, but carved with a single word, return. The ring expands. A second candle appears, marked and waiting. The effigy now bears a crescent scar. Someone, or something, has marked Lydia's actions, and is awaiting a reply. Chapter 5, The Candle That Burned Blue. There are discoveries that make themselves known by sound or spectacle, by shock or sudden gesture, and then there are those which arrive silently, as if they had always been present, simply waiting for someone, anyone, who would bother to notice. That was the nature of the candles Miss Marple found standing upright in the center of the expanded Vanishing ring, one aflame, quiet and steady, despite the wind, and the other cold and dark, carved with a single word, return, in a hand both old and deliberate. She did not touch them. She observed as she always did, first with her eyes, then with memory. It had been nearly 48 hours since the wax figure bearing her likeness had cracked and bled red, since the ledger at the bottom of the candle shop's trunk had revealed a generation-spanning pattern of names marked in cryptic symbols, circles, crosses, and lines with no obvious translation. And now, here in the clearing, stood a reply, not to her presence perhaps, but to Lydia's absence. The ring had grown, and it had answered. That morning, as dawn broke over St. Netherwell, with a hesitant sky and no birdsong, Miss Marple returned quietly to the rectory. The glass bowl remained where she had left it, the effigy beneath it unchanged, but her mind had not rested, and she could no longer defer the conversation she had been avoiding. The vicar found her in the chapel antechamber, his sleeves rolled, his collar loose, his eyes dark from a night of broken sleep. When she asked if they might speak, he simply nodded and led her toward the vestry, past the altar, past the worn hymnals, past the dust-laced corners where secrets did not shout but lingered like unwelcome incense. She spoke first. "You've seen the rings before." He did not respond immediately. Then softly, once, in 1976, I was 16. My brother found one behind the west orchard where the blackthorn grows too thick for cattle. There was a candle there as well. My grandmother burned it without touching it. And what did she call it? He hesitated. Then, an offering. Miss Marple nodded once, and now, I fear the offering has been made again. He did not say Lydia's name, but he did not need to. It was then that the vicar walked to an old cabinet beneath the stained glass of St. Agnes and withdrew a volume bound in rough leather. The hinges creaked. The spine was held together with brass rivets, worn smooth by generations of hands. He set it down with care, opened it to the middle, and turned it toward her. The page was labeled, Observations on the Candlemas Offering, as kept by Reverend E. G. Morton, 1891-1923. Beneath that heading, a list of dates, all centered on Candlemas Eves, spaced almost precisely 40 years apart, each marked with a name: 1892, M. Cartwright; 1932, R. Fern; 1976, name left blank; 2020, space preserved; Miss Marple placed a gloved hand gently on the parchment. "Ah, Fern," she said softly. "That would be Rosalind, Lydia's grandmother." "Yes," the vicar replied. "She vanished the same night the plague stones were uncovered behind the old mill. They say the candle never melted. And the blank in 76. My mother," he said, "though she never disappeared. She confessed something instead." "What sort of confession?" He closed the book. "That there are those who have always believed the offering must continue, whether by faith, family, or force. And who decides who is offered?" His eyes met hers. "No one says, but every time it's a girl, always 16, always close to the flame." Miss Marple returned to the rectory in silence. The pieces were no longer fragments. They were beginning to form a pattern, one laced with rage, betrayal, and a legacy cloaked in ritual, but hardened by time.
She opened Lydia's diary once more that evening. There, tucked in the fold of the final page, was a dried sprig of yew. Beneath it, a new line had been added since she had last checked.
"It's always been the flame, but what if the flame is watching back?" Miss Marple closed the book, and for the first time in many years, she felt something that made her pause. Not fear, not grief, but a quiet warning, like footsteps heard just beyond the corner of one's thoughts.
That night, as the village settled into its hush, Miss Marple sat beside her lamp and lit the small bedside candle the vicar had left her days before. It flared to life, soft and golden, and then, without provocation, it flared blue. Brilliant, unnatural, silent, then sputtered out. No wind, no touch. And for one long breath, the wick remained dark, until the flame returned. Blue again. But this time, there was no wick. The wick was gone. That, above all, was the fact that Miss Marple could not and would not dismiss. A candle without a wick, when lit, is no longer a tool of light. It becomes something else entirely. A signal, perhaps. A presence masquerading as memory. A mirror held up to something too old to speak and too recent to ignore. She did not extinguish it. She watched. The blue flame danced not wildly, but deliberately, pulsing as if to an unheard rhythm, casting no true glow, yet revealing more than shadow. On the wall beside the dresser, the shape of the flame cast a ring, not 3 circles as before, but one, a single, closed loop, turning slowly across the wooden grain as though marking time. And then it stopped. It was morning before the flame finally faded on its own. At breakfast, Miss Marple found Beatrice staring into a teacup gone cold, the spoons beside her untouched. A telegram sat unopened beside the sugar bowl. "The archives sent it," Beatrice said without prompting. "The county register. You asked about Lydia's great-grandmother, Rosalind Fern." Miss Marple opened the envelope, and inside was a single, aged birth register, a marriage certificate, and a copy of a disappearance record, thin on details, but clear on one thing. Rosalind Fern had last been seen on Candlemas Eve. The statement from the attending reverend read simply, "She left the procession before the final blessing and did not return. Candle remained burning." What struck Miss Marple most was not the vagueness, but the consistency. The wording was nearly identical to the phrasing used in the church's more recent internal notes about Lydia. The pattern had not merely repeated, it had been preserved, reused, as if ritual required not just sacrifice, but documentation. Miss Marple folded the telegram and tucked it into her handbag. She returned to the church, this time not to search the vestry or revisit the altar, but to speak directly with the one man who had, until now, said too little and revealed too much. She found the vicar kneeling near the font, polishing the brass plate with steady, tired hands. "She wasn't the first," she said plainly. He did not look up. "No, you knew her name was on that ledger." He stood slowly. "Yes, and that Lydia had been writing of the offering long before this year." "I didn't know what she meant," he answered. "I told myself it was just curiosity. A girl with questions. They always ask questions, until they're told not to." "She wasn't told," Miss Marple said. "She saw." The vicar's eyes darted briefly toward the stained glass of St. Bridget, protector of light, fire, and home. Then his gaze dropped again. "She found the original prayer."
he whispered, the one we no longer say aloud, the one that was meant to bind the light, not ask it for blessing. Miss Marple tilted her head. What was it? He opened a drawer near the hymnals and withdrew a parchment, more fragile than most, and carefully unfolded it. At the top, a faded Latin inscription, Lucerna non petit venier, Lucerna audit. The flame does not ask for forgiveness, the flame listens. Beneath it, a chant, words not found in any Anglican text, markings beside each line, breath patterns, notations to indicate pauses, ritual spacing, and then in the margin, faint pencil scrawl, used 1892, repeated 1932, unspoken since. She was going to say it, the vicar said. Lydia. She asked me if the words still held power. I told her no, but I lied. Why? His voice cracked, not loudly, but inwardly, like a fault line deep beneath stone. Because if it still holds power, then we never stopped it, we only covered it with silence. Miss Marple returned to the rectory before dusk. She sat by her fire with Lydia's diary open beside her, the telegram on her lap, and the candle, blue wicked, or rather wickless, now placed under a jar. She reviewed the drawings again. One had caught her attention before, but now, in the context of Rosalind Fern's name, it demanded scrutiny. 3 figures standing at the edge of a circle, one in shadow, one mid-step, one kneeling. At first she thought it symbolic, but now she realized the third figure, the one kneeling, was not facing inward, she was facing out, watching. The entry beside the image read, I found the page, I found her name, but I think she stayed to watch, not to warn. Miss Marple exhaled. There was something unspoken buried beneath each name, not just disappearance, but witnessing. Not all the girls had vanished. Some had remained long enough to see what came next, and in doing so, had been changed. She heard the wind rise just once outside, though the air was still. She turned to her lamp. The wickless candle flared again, just briefly, and this time it flickered blue and red at once. 2 flames, 1 base. Miss Marple did not sleep. The blue and red flame twinned, breathing from the same core, without wick, without fuel, did not flicker like fire. It pulsed, in and out, as if responding not to air but to thought. She watched it until the candle's base had cooled, despite the fire above it, and then, as quietly as it had ignited, it extinguished itself. Not a sound, only the faint scent of wax and something older, like scorched vellum. When dawn came, Miss Marple dressed in grey tweed and returned to the chapel, seeking not the vicar this time, but the oldest records still held by the parish. The back library had not been touched in years. Dust clung to titles barely visible beneath their curled spines. Some pages had become fused from damp, others brittle to the edge of collapse. But behind one warped volume titled Genealogical Annotations, St. Netherwell, 1602, something thin fell loose. She caught it before it hit the floor, a single folded sheet, heavy parchment, yellowed at the creases. It had no title, just a name, inked across the top in rushed hand, E. Fern. She unfolded it carefully, and there, across a full page, was a transcription written decades before, each word separated by slashes, each line indented in mirror of chant. A ritual perhaps, but far more personal than prayer. It was addressed, not to a god, but to an unnamed listener. Midway down the sheet, a section marked Offered Warnings stood out. If the flame returns with colour, do not answer, for the eye that watches sees response as permission. Beneath it, the one who breaks silence becomes flame. Miss Marple stared long at that line. It was not metaphor, it was instruction, or threat. She placed the page into her satchel without further reading, and turned to leave. But as she reached the chapel's stone threshold, she paused. Someone had left a bundle on the pew nearest the vestry door. It had not been there when she entered. She approached. The cloth was folded, a fine linen handkerchief, embroidered with a single L. Inside it, 3 objects, a burnt matchstick, a small carved figurine of wax, and a pressed photograph, Lydia standing beside the chapel on Candlemas Eve. Her smile was familiar, but the longer one looked, the stranger it became, for there over her left shoulder was a hand, resting gently, almost lovingly upon her coat, and yet no body was attached, no figure behind her, only the hand, pale, deliberate. Miss Marple did not flinch. She knew better. Instead, she walked to the vicar's quarters and placed the photograph upon his desk. "She was chosen," he said softly. "No," Miss Marple replied. "She was prepared." That night, as the wind shifted in from the woods once again, and the villagers drew their curtains with unusual haste, Miss Marple retired early, placing both the ledger and Lydia's diary beside her bed. She lit a single candle, this time her own. It burned steady, no blue. She turned the pages of the diary one final time before bed. There, scribbled in the margin of the last page, barely visible under a line about the eye in the fire, was a phrase in Latin she had seen once before: Lucerna audit, the flame listens. She closed the book, drew the covers around her, and settled her thoughts in silence, until a sound, soft, like breath through glass. She turned. The candle had extinguished. No breeze, no motion. She reached for the matchbox, and paused. The flame had returned. No spark, no touch, just light, but not gold, nor orange, blue. Then the center glowed white, and without a wick it twisted into a perfect ring, suspended, unmoving, watching. The wickless candle flares blue, forms a floating ring of white flame. Not heat, not warning, witnessing. Where are you watching from? And in your view, what would bring justice for the girl who vanished into the offering? Tell us before the next ring burns.
Chapter 6. An Invitation to the Dark. Miss Marple did not blink. The flame hovered, perfectly round, impossibly motionless. It neither crackled nor wavered, suspended above the cooled candle in a ring of faint blue-white glow. It defied everything she knew about combustion, about fuel, about faith and physics, and all the other quiet systems that hold a world together. And yet, she felt no fear, only precision, as if she were being measured. When the flame at last extinguished, not with smoke but a silent blink, she rose, placed the candle under a glass bell, and drew the curtains back with meticulous calm. Outside, the village still slept, unaware of what had just visited her bedside, or perhaps more accurately, what had awakened. At breakfast, the mood was muted, and Beatrice looked as though she had barely slept. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed the tea. "I found it," she said suddenly, her voice brittle but determined. Lydia's diary. She'd hidden it beneath the lining of the wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Miss Marple accepted the small book with a quiet nod. The cover was cracked, its clasp stained with age. The first few pages were unremarkable. Dates, daily thoughts, mild complaints about the shop, her mother's overbearing nature. But by the third week of January, something shifted. The writing grew tighter, slanted, compressed, words repeated, light, names, circles. On one page, a sketched symbol, 3 intersecting rings, burned into the paper as though seared from memory. Then came the entry. A single line, in script jagged with pressure. "He's coming for me." There was no explanation, no date, no context, just those 5 words, followed by a smear of graphite, as though her hand had been dragged mid-sentence. Below it, the faint echo of another line, erased or rubbed to near invisibility, though one word remained: legacy. Miss Marple said nothing. She closed the diary carefully and placed it into her handbag, along with the photograph of Lydia and the hand that had no owner. Later that afternoon, children from the village began gathering in the courtyard of the chapel, as they often did when their lessons had ended and the winter light had begun to thin. But today, the games they played were stranger, more rehearsed, less joyful. They were singing, not a nursery rhyme, not a hymn, but something old. A single voice began, soft and rhythmic, until others joined with eerie synchronicity. "Light your flame, say his name, or sleep in dark and wake in shame." Again and again they sang it, until the vicar stepped out from the vestry and barked for silence. "Who taught you that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The children fell still. Several looked confused. One child, Marjorie Bloom, age 7, blinked slowly and answered with troubling calm, "No one. We've always known it." Miss Marple watched this exchange in silence. Her gaze moved from the girl to the rest, then toward the chapel itself. Her thoughts, however, settled somewhere deeper below. The crypt. That evening, she requested the key. The vicar resisted at first, citing protocol, respect, disrepair, but at her insistence, and perhaps his own unspoken guilt, he yielded. The door to the crypt had not been opened in years. Its iron hinges groaned faintly, but the air that met them was not stale. It was warm, and the stone beneath her shoes was wet. A trail led downward, bare feet, clearly defined, traced in damp upon cold stone. Toes, heel, arch, no shoes, no socks, and crucially, no returning prints. Miss Marple descended without a word, her shoes silent upon the aged stone. The crypt was modest in size, its walls lined with aged plaques, some of which had begun to disintegrate from time's slow press, names barely legible, dates faded, among them, 3 from Lydia's family line, all Candlemas Eve. She stepped deeper. In the furthest corner, beneath a wooden arch reinforced with soot-darkened beams, lay a low altar. No candles, no scripture, but beneath it, a groove in the floor, circular, not carved, burned. The ring was not recent, nor ancient, but it had been renewed. Someone had returned here, not long ago, and used fire, not to banish darkness, but to summon something. Miss Marple knelt beside the burned ring, and placed her hand above the stone. It was still warm, too warm. She stood again, and as she turned, her breath caught, not from fear, nor cold, from knowing. For behind her on the wall, someone had etched a single line. Speak once, and he sees you. Speak twice, and he comes. There was no signature, only a smear, wax, dark, unnatural, almost resinous. She traced it with her gloved finger, then turned back toward the stairs. The footprints still led down, still no prints returning, and as she reached the threshold, the wind outside picked up, pushing the chapel door open with a hollow thud. No sound came from the courtyard, no birds, no bells, no steps, only the faintest echo, half-whispered, half-remembered from the direction of the children's voices earlier. Light your flame, say his name. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, with her gloves still warm from the stone below. She removed her coat, sat in the quiet drawing-room, and placed Lydia's diary on her lap again. Not as a curious observer this time, but as a reader with motive. There had been something overlooked in those pages, something her eye had skimmed past before, dismissed as scribble or shadow. But now, knowing what she'd seen, what she'd felt, she looked with different purpose. The ink was aged, but fresh enough to capture mood. Lydia had not written for leisure. Her hand was sometimes hurried, other times strangely deliberate. On one page, 4 days before Candlemas, there was an entire passage written backward, as though meant for reflection in a mirror. Miss Marple reached for a small brass tray on the side table, and tilted it toward the firelight. The letters, when reversed, revealed a passage unmarked in the rest of the journal. It began as poetry, or perhaps a chant. To speak his name is to lose one's own, to walk his path is never alone. Beneath it, a list: Fern, Lydia, Fern, Elsbeth, Fern, Jonan, Fern, Aldry, 3 generations, all Candlemas, all vanished, each name scratched faintly beneath a separate ring, hand-drawn circles, Widdowshin in motion, but the final ring had something else inside it. 2 overlapping initials, not Lydia's. B.F. Miss Marple's lips thinned. Beatrice, Fern. She sat in stillness for a long while, before folding the diary closed, and standing, brisk but not hurried. Beatrice was in the kitchen, buttering a scone with distracted care. Her hair was slightly untamed, her posture tense, and her eyes, when she looked up, held something less than surprise and more than concern. "Miss Marple," she said too quickly, "is everything all right?" Miss Marple regarded her with that gentle, unwavering gaze she had cultivated across years of watching, of listening. "My dear," she said, "were you ever told what happened to Lydia's great-grandmother?" Beatrice paused. Her fingers gripped the butter knife tighter than necessary. "There was an accident," she said finally, "out near the moor. She wandered too far from the path, they said.
Miss Marple inclined her head. They said. Beatrice set the knife down. The edge of it had dented the soft wood of the cutting board. Her next words were quieter. They never found her. Only her shawl, and the candle, still burning. And her name, Miss Marple prompted gently. Elspeth, Beatrice said after a pause. Elspeth Fern. She was 16, like Lydia. It's just a story, a family misfortune. Miss Marple waited. Beatrice looked away. Or that's what I wanted it to be. There was a silence, not empty. It was watching. I used to find her name scratched under the altar stones when I was little, Beatrice said softly, almost to herself. Every Candlemas, someone would write it. I thought it was some sort of family ritual, but no one ever talked about it. My father forbade questions, even when the chalk wouldn't wash away. Did Lydia ever mention the offering? Miss Marple asked. Beatrice flinched. No. But she began lighting candles in threes, always in threes. She wouldn't explain why. Was she afraid of someone? Beatrice did not answer immediately. Then slowly, she walked to the far drawer of the old sideboard, unlocked it with a small brass key she kept on a chain beneath her blouse, and retrieved a folded sheet of paper, creased, discolored at the edges. She gave me this 2 days before she vanished, told me not to read it, unless she didn't come back. She handed it to Miss Marple. The writing was Lydia's. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. The text, however, was more confessional than frightened. He marked me. I didn't say the rhyme. I mocked it. Now the blue has come twice. Once in the shop behind the sealed room. Once by my bed. It isn't about punishment. It's about inheritance. And at the very bottom, a final line in capitals. I am not the first. And I am not alone. Miss Marple folded the note. Slower this time. She turned back to Beatrice. My dear, she said softly, you said you found the diary this morning. Are you quite sure it was only today? Beatrice hesitated. Her knuckles whitened as her hands gripped the edge of the table. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, I've had it for 5 days. Miss Marple nodded slowly. There was one truth left unspoken, she murmured, and it was waiting for her. Night did not fall upon St. Netherwell so much as it folded in, a silent yielding, not quite darkness but an absence of warmth, of comfort, of expectation. The village lamps flickered earlier than usual. Doors closed without sound, curtains drawn by hands no longer curious, and from somewhere near the edge of the chapel courtyard came the rising cadence of a children's song. Miss Marple stepped out into the open air, her breath held tight in her chest, as though the very act of exhaling might disturb something listening. The voices were unmistakable. The children again. Same tune, same rhythm, only this time no laughter. They stood in a ring, 9 of them, barefoot in the grass, their faces solemn, their hands joined loosely. In the center of their circle, a candle, and not just any candle, it was Lydia's, the one found in the woods, still pristine, still alight, only now the flame was blue. They chanted without instruction, their voices never rising above a murmur, never losing pace, never questioning. Light your flame, say his name, or sleep in dark and wake in shame. Beatrice had followed Miss Marple silently to the edge of the yard. When she saw the candle, she staggered back a step. That's impossible, she whispered. I buried it, myself, but there it was, lit, scented, accepted. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly. The children did not flinch. Their eyes remained open, unblinking, even as she crossed the threshold of their circle. The moment her shoes passed over the outer ring of their formation, the candle flared, tall and sharp, with no source of wind, and then one voice broke from the chorus. A single child, the same girl, Marjorie Bloom. She turned to Miss Marple, eyes wide and voice flat. He knows now that you've come below. And just like that, the circle scattered, quietly, without panic, children drifting back to their homes as if released from a spell. But Miss Marple had no interest in symbols anymore. She needed answers, and there was only one place those footprints had ever led, back to the crypt. She descended alone. This time the door opened without resistance. The heat was stronger. The trail of footprints, now faint and less distinct, still glistened faintly in the moonlight seeping through the stained glass slats above. But there was something else now, a second trail, smaller, narrower, fresher, still wet, leading deeper into the crypt. Not toward the altar, but behind it, to a recess she had missed before, a slight curvature of stone, blocked by a heavy bookcase filled with outdated hymnals. She moved it aside, and behind the stone, carved in quiet secrecy, a door, old, wood thickened by age, hinged in rust, and upon it, a sigil, 3 rings, burned in reverse. She pressed her palm against it. It gave. No creak, no scrape, just open. A passage lay beyond, narrow, cut into rock, sloped downward, and the air that rose to greet her was not warm, it was wet. She stepped forward, one step, then another, until someone, whispered, "You carry her voice." Miss Marple stopped. The voice was male, low, deliberate, but there was no one before her, no echo, no retreating steps, only the soft flicker of light, far, far down the tunnel, barely visible, but unmistakable in hue, blue. She withdrew, slow and careful, her breath steady, her pulse unreadable. Once again she sealed the door, and once again she made her way back through the crypt, past names long silenced, beneath stones still warm, past rings burned where time was not welcome. She returned to the vicarage without word, but when she opened her bedroom door, she did not scream, she did not panic, she simply stared, for upon her pillow, carefully placed, perfectly sculpted, was a wax effigy, small, fragile, mouth sealed, hands folded, face unmistakably her own, and beneath it, scratched into the linen, one word, inheritance. Chapter 7, The Pact of 3. The effigy remained upon Miss Marple's pillow for exactly 3 minutes, and then, without sound, it cracked, not from weight, nor pressure, nor heat, but with the faintest creasing at the jaw, a line so thin it could have been mistaken for dust, splitting downward until the figure's mouth parted slightly, revealing a hollow space inside, as if it had once contained breath. Miss Marple said nothing. Her eyes did not move, but her hands, long unflinching in their quiet work, carefully placed the effigy into the drawer beside her bed, and locked it. That night, the heir did not sleep. By morning she was walking the perimeter of the churchyard with Beatrice trailing behind like a thread unravelling from her sleeve. The sun clung to the low clouds, reluctant, as if even it suspected what had been kept secret under stone and oath. Beatrice spoke at last. "The wax, who would place such a thing in your room?" "Someone with memory," Miss Marple replied. "Not of me, but of something I once touched, something they believe I left behind." The vicar's study was locked when they arrived, but it did not resist. Inside, shelves of forgotten sermons, rusted keys that fit nothing in the village, and an entire drawer devoted to Candlemas records dating back before the First War. The dust here was too even, the parchment stacked too perfectly. Something had been removed recently. Miss Marple could sense it. She moved to the cabinet nearest the fireplace, where old parish photographs were kept in leather sleeves. One by one she reviewed them. Candlemas processions, school blessings, and then a photograph she did not remember, dated 1944. 3 figures stood before the altar, the former vicar, a farmer whose name had been scrubbed from village memory, and a younger woman with a scarf tied too deliberately to be modesty. Behind them, barely in focus, almost swallowed by the shadow of a curtain, stood a 4th figure. But the line of the chin, the shape of the mouth, the tilt of the nose, it was Miss Marple, only, it could not be. She had not visited St. Netherwell until the 1950s, and yet, there she was. They called themselves the Three, the vicar said softly from the doorway. He had entered unnoticed. Beatrice startled, but Miss Marple remained still. "You knew," she said quietly, "about the offering." He nodded once. "My mother was one of them. The other 2 were buried side by side under the old yew. No markers. That was the condition." Miss Marple turned toward him. "And what was the reason?" The vicar's eyes, which had always been warm if not entirely innocent, darkened. "During the plague, not the Black Death, but one of the lesser ones, just after the Blitz, a fever took 3 dozen in the village. The old healer, Margot Ellis, she offered a ritual, the offering, once a generation, on Candlemas Eve." "To whom?" Marple asked. "No name was ever spoken," he replied. "Only a promise, and they kept it. The illness ceased overnight. The pact was signed in silence, sealed with light." Miss Marple said nothing for several seconds. "Then Lydia's great-grandmother vanished during that very time." "Yes, and now it is Lydia's turn. A long breath passed between them, as if all the years that had elapsed were being exhaled into the present. "Why her?" Beatrice asked, her voice cracking. "Why always a girl? Why that family?" The vicar did not answer. Instead, he handed Marple an envelope. "You must read this alone. It was my mother's confession. She wrote it when the first symptoms began, said the pact must survive her." Marple took it without a word, but in her chest a pressure bloomed. Not fear, not grief, recognition, for she now knew something had been waiting, and it was not content with Lydia. It had a memory, and now a face. It was in the vicar's study, hidden behind a loose panel of warped walnut, that Miss Marple's hand landed on the second piece of the covenant. A letter, carefully preserved, yellowing at the corners, its seal unbroken, but the handwriting, decisive, ornate, unnervingly neat, was unmistakable. Agnes Durrant, the vicar's wife. Though her tone in public was gentle and pious, the words penned here told a different story, one of deliberation, resolve, and something dangerously close to guilt. If the offering is broken, then what came before returns. "We three swore by circle and fire. Lydia knows nothing. She must not." The pages continued, cryptic phrases, half-destroyed verses, instructions tied to old rites. And there, buried near the bottom of the letter, one name circled in ink so dark it had bled through. E. Marple. Not Jane. No other explanation. But it wasn't a coincidence. Miss Marple's hands did not tremble, her breath did not quicken, but her eyes narrowed. The following afternoon, while the village carried on in strained routine, candle-makers reopening shutters, grocers speaking in lowered tones, Miss Marple requested tea with Agnes Durrant. The invitation was accepted at once. When they sat down in the drawing-room overlooking the western hedgerow, there was a moment, brief yet thick with memory, when neither woman spoke. Agnes poured, jasmine and chamomile, her hands graceful, unbothered, but her gaze, never quite steady. Miss Marple began gently, as always. She inquired about Lydia, about the children's rhyme, about the little wax figure left upon her pillow. Agnes smiled with the corners of her mouth, but not with her eyes. "Oh, Jane," she said lightly, "you've always had such an imagination." That was when Miss Marple placed the letter on the table. Agnes's fingers froze midway to the cup. The room became still. One could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock across the hall, and the faint rustle of ivy against the panes. And then, a whisper, barely spoken. "We were just girls. The plague took 9 in one winter. 9. I lost my sister, and so you offered a child." Miss Marple's tone was even, not accusing, only curious. "You called it a pact." Agnes didn't answer. Her hand hovered above the teacup, then dropped. Slowly she leaned back and exhaled. Not defeat, not confession, but something softer. Resignation. "We were told it would end if we kept the promise. And it did, for a time." Miss Marple leaned forward, speaking with precision. "And the others, who were they?" Agnes's answer came with difficulty. "Eleanor Greaves, midwife, passed on 6 years ago. And Hetty Finch, Lydia's great-grandmother. And Lydia, she was born on the same day the last candle went out. Her name was chosen before she could walk." There was no shock in Miss Marple's response, only calculation. She had begun to see the shape of it now, vague at first, like wax pooling beneath heat, but undeniable. And so she asked one more question. "Why is my name in the letter?" Agnes met her gaze for the first time without blinking. "We weren't meant to survive that year. We sought protection. The ritual required 4. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "There were only 3 of you." Agnes's voice lowered. "We lied." Miss Marple left the Durrants' residence without further comment, her walking shoes silent against the flagstones, her expression unreadable. She passed 3 village boys kicking a flattened tin pail along the green, and though one of them paused to wave, her mind remained tethered to Agnes's words. "We lied." The afternoon light had begun to dim, softening edges and casting long slants of amber across the high grass near the chapel gate. In that golden hush, her memory stirred of a much earlier visit to St. Netherwell, years ago, no decades, a fleeting summer. She remembered only fragments, a scent of rosemary, a ribbon tied to a gate-post, and an uncomfortable pressure in the chapel that had never quite lifted. And yet, if she had truly been here then, surely she would have remembered more.
That night, Miss Marple returned to Beatrice's guest room with a notebook and a question turning in slow circles inside her mind. What if Lydia's fate had already been sealed before her birth? What if someone, somehow had ensured the old rites would continue uninterrupted, unchallenged, unquestioned? She reviewed the facts. There were 3 names on the pact. One had died, one had confessed, one was connected by blood to Lydia. But that 4th, the shape never named. She opened Lydia's diary again, pages torn at odd angles, ink smudged by careless hands or perhaps anxious ones. And there, beneath a line drawn twice in a darker pen, was the curious phrase, "I saw her again today, the woman in the glass. She looks like me, but her eyes are older." The diary offered no further explanation. The next morning, Beatrice returned from the post office holding a parcel wrapped in cloth and wax string. "Left for you," she told her aunt, but no return address. Inside was a photograph, black and white, heavily faded, creased across one corner. A small group stood among the oaks behind the old chapel, 4 figures dressed in ceremonial garb. One held a candle, another an open book, the third an infant wrapped in lace, and the 4th, though grainy, her features were unmistakable, Miss Jane Marple, younger, much, no hat, her hair tied back, her gaze fixed solemnly at the camera. The background blurred, but her likeness remained precise. Miss Marple said nothing for a long time. She examined the photo under the light by the sitting-room window, traced its edges, held it to the sunlight. She had never been present at such a gathering, and yet there she was. The silence in the room thickened, no longer empty. It was watching. That evening, Beatrice found her aunt sitting motionless by the fireside, the photograph now resting on the small table beside her teacup. Her fingers drummed against the arm of the chair once, twice, then stopped. She turned her head just slightly. "Tell me, my dear, have you ever considered the possibility of memory being misplaced rather than lost?" Beatrice blinked. "Misplaced?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes the mind chooses not to hold what it cannot bear, and sometimes, just sometimes, what it refuses to hold has never belonged to it at all." The candle on the table flickered. A gust of wind passed across the roof, and that night, long after the house had settled into quiet, Miss Marple rose once more and lit a single taper at her window. It burned steady, blue, then dimmed, and without wick it flared again.
Chapter 8. Wax doesn't forget. The silence held its breath, not the usual quiet of sleep or solemnity, but the kind that presses against the edges of one's thoughts like wet cloth over a flame, heavy, unwelcoming, and all too aware. Morning had not yet arrived, and the air in St. Netherwell, though still, seemed unnaturally dense, almost expectant. Miss Marple, ever the observer of patterns both logical and illogical, had risen with her thoughts already racing, sharpened not by fear, but by something colder, clarity. Earlier, tucked beneath her chamber window, she had found it, a second wax figure. This one bore the unmistakable shape of Beatrice's brooch, and wore, across its soft shoulders, a delicate thread of blue silk. Miss Marple's hands had trembled only slightly as she turned it in the candlelight, noting how the effigy's arms were curled unnaturally, its eyes, tiny pins pressed into the surface, glinting as if aware. It was the second figure in as many nights. The first had been her own. Beatrice had not yet woken when Miss Marple stepped softly through the drawing-room and down the hallway, but her voice, low, hoarse, murmured faintly behind the door, "Lydia, don't let him in," over and over again, like a hymn misremembered. The girl had never spoken in her sleep before, and now her words were no longer her own. The previous day had uncovered one of the strangest of revelations, a wartime pact involving the vicar's wife, Miss Templeton of the Archives, and Thomas Greeley, who now lay ill and half-mad at the edge of the village, a vow of protection in exchange for a tradition no longer spoken aloud. But traditions, Miss Marple thought, did not perish with progress. They receded and waited. She had risen not only from rest, but from a growing sense of necessity. This was no longer about Lydia alone. The wax that now ran red from Lydia's final candle was no artisan's accident, and if that same candle, untouched by breeze, still stood firm beside the chapel altar, its flame eternal and unnatural. Then the truth was no longer just buried, it was burning. It was just before first light, when Miss Marple entered the study again and opened Lydia's diary for a second reading. The pages, fragile but unfaded, were stained in places, perhaps with wax, perhaps something else, and smudged where Lydia's hand must have trembled. One page had been folded twice, dog-eared, then flattened again as though someone had both tried to hide it and reveal it in equal measure. On that page, a single line struck Miss Marple with a kind of quiet force. "I saw myself in the glass today, but it wasn't me." The entry was dated 2 days before the Candlemas procession. The lines that followed told of dreams, of standing in rings of ash and watching trees bend, not in wind but in agreement, of a song she hadn't known she knew, and then simply, "He's coming for me." Miss Marple closed the diary gently. Downstairs, the fire had long since died in the hearth, but the coals beneath still glowed, like ancient embers too stubborn to forget what they had once lit. A shadow stretched across the floor, though the flame had not flickered. She turned. There was nothing there, but the reflection in the mirror above the mantel. That was another matter. Lydia. Not as she was in life, but still, unmistakably her. The girl's eyes were wide, her face pale as smoke, her hair falling over one shoulder in thick, wet strands. She stood behind Miss Marple, only in the glass, and she was not blinking, and then gone. No sound, no cold air shift, only a brief dimming of the room, as though the light itself had held its breath. And that, dear viewer, is where we shall pause. Before we continue, I must ask you, where are you watching from, and what do you believe might bring justice for such a violation of innocence and tradition? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Miss Marple did not turn to face the reflection. Not immediately. She had long learned that some truths arrive when one waits, not when one chases. The mirror, once a mere ornament above the hearth, now hung like a doorway to something left unspoken. Her hand rested on the edge of the mantel, steady, deliberate, though her mind for the briefest flicker reeled. She had seen Lydia. Of that there was no question. But there had been something different about the girl, not just the damp hair, or the odd stillness in her eyes, but a detail more fragile, more disturbing. The necklace. It was an heirloom. Lydia's grandmother had worn it in the 1924 Candlemas photograph, the one Miss Marple had reviewed the evening prior. It had not been seen on Lydia in life. It had never been mentioned by her mother. Yet in the reflection, it hung around her neck, a small wax seal pendant with 3 circles carved faintly into its surface, the same circles scorched into the clearing behind the chapel, the widowsheen ring. Miss Marple returned to the diary, this time searching for the unspoken, marginalia, scratched out sentences, ink patterns that suggested hesitation or pressure. She noticed a shift. About 3 weeks before Lydia's disappearance, the girl's pen strokes had changed, no longer linear or meticulous. They broke in rhythm, staggered. One entry ended with the phrase, "He walks in their footsteps but leaves none of his own." Another, "Bea knows. I didn't tell her, but she knows. And she's angry. Beatrice." Miss Marple's companion, her confidante in this strange descent, if that word could even contain what had taken place over these last days. Beatrice had been calm, analytical, rational, until last night. She had not spoken during supper, had barely touched her tea, and later, in her sleep, had whispered Lydia's name over and over again, sometimes pleading, sometimes warning, sometimes as though summoning. Miss Marple rose from the study and made her way to Beatrice's door. It was slightly ajar. The fire in the guest room had burned down, the scent of lavender faint in the air, and there, beside the bed, stood something that should not have been there, another wax figure. But this one was different. Where the previous effigies had been crude, shaped in haste, lacking in detail, this was meticulous, detailed, intimate, the fold of the dress, the tilt of the head, the very shape of Beatrice's hands pressed into the wax. And more disturbingly, the figure was placed not lying down, but standing, facing the mirror. Miss Marple did not disturb it.
Instead, she stepped softly to the bedside where Beatrice lay, her forehead damp, her breathing shallow, and her lips moving in a slow cadence that did not match the rhythm of her breath. "Lydia," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He promised, but she said no. There was a sudden sound, wood creaking. Miss Marple turned sharply, but there was no one there. Only the fire, flaring briefly, and the wax figure beginning to lean, ever so slightly forward. She reached down to Beatrice's hand and found, pressed against her palm, a small piece of paper, folded tightly, wrapped in twine. When opened, it revealed no message, only a symbol, 3 interlocking circles, and beneath it, a word scratched in hurried ink. Again, Miss Marple's thoughts turned not to the supernatural, never first to that, but to the concept of ritual. Ritual, after all, is repetition made sacred, and this pattern, wax figure, mirror apparition, symbolic repetition, was beginning to form a closed loop. If Lydia had truly known she was chosen, and had resisted, could this be punishment, or warning? And if Beatrice had become its next focus, then the offering was not finished. The storm did not come from the sky, but from thought, pressing in on Miss Marple with a cold precision as she stepped outside and into the heavy silence that now ruled the lane between the guest house and the chapel. Lantern in hand, shawl drawn tight, her footsteps echoed along the old stone path as if the very earth had begun to listen. She moved without hesitation. Fear did not guide her, a question did, one rooted not in superstition, but in motive. Why now, and why Lydia? The red wax had been no illusion. She had seen it, dripping steadily from Lydia's candle behind the altar, unmoved by wind or weather, as though obeying rules far removed from the natural world. Its flame, a blue so deep it almost vanished against the dark, had burned uninterrupted since the Candlemas Eve procession, where Lydia was last seen. But the wax had changed. Only 2 days ago it was white, yesterday, pale pink, tonight it bled. Inside the chapel, the air was too still. Even with the doors ajar behind her, no breeze stirred the heavy crimson drapes near the altar. The floorboards did not creak, they watched. The old candles, long extinguished, offered no scent of smoke. Yet one flame persisted, Lydia's, still upright on its iron plate, surrounded now by a strange arrangement of dried rosemary, salt, and wax petals. A charm, but for what? Miss Marple advanced slowly, the lantern casting shadows behind every pew. There were footsteps not far behind her own, faint, irregular, as if made not in the moment but moments before. She looked back. Nothing. She moved forward again, and there, near the foot of the altar, darker than wax, thicker than oil, lay the residue, red, deep, viscous, yet not blood. It had no scent, no warmth, but it stained, and it moved, very slightly, very slowly, upward, toward the flame, as if drawn. Miss Marple stared, heart steady, mind racing. This was not hysteria, nor theatre. Someone had altered the candle, but for what reason, and why leave it here, open to discovery? She remembered Lydia's diary. I saw myself in the glass today, but it wasn't me. And Beatrice's whisper, he promised. Who? She stepped back, lifting the lantern high to inspect the corners of the chapel. There was something etched into the altar's underside, barely visible unless one were kneeling. 3 letters, Mem-R-N. She froze. Those initials were familiar. They belonged to Margaret Ruth Netherwell, the last girl to vanish. Lydia's great-grandmother. No one had seen her again. No body, no farewell, only a story, and a date. Candlemas Eve, 40 years ago. Lydia had not been chosen by accident. She was a legacy, and if this was to repeat every generation, then Beatrice too was linked. Not by blood, but by name. Her family had arrived in St. Netherwell only recently, but her mother's side, yes, Miss Marple recalled, the Holloways, and one of them, Holloway Templeton, had been one of the 3 original pact signers, a new offering each generation, no longer a folklore tale, but a brutal pattern, and the reaction, violent, planned, yet somehow veiled in ritual. The wax figures, the diary, the rhyme on the children's lips, none of it spontaneous, all constructed, a performance of secrecy, but for whom? Miss Marple reached for the candle. As her fingers neared, the flame flared blue, high, unnatural, and went out. She stepped back, a hiss of sound, low and unmistakable, and then it reignited, No wick, just wax, still bleeding. She heard it then, her name, soft, familiar, Jane. She turned sharply. The mirror in the chapel, an old clouded piece leaned against the back wall, revealed nothing but her own face, until it didn't. Behind her reflection, Lydia stood, and this time she smiled, but only in the glass. Chapter 9, The Fire Beneath. It began with silence, silence that did not rest, but leaned, a kind of silence that seemed to press itself into the walls, into the crevices of the candle shop's stone floor, into the folds of fabric where wax once dripped unnoticed and hardened into memory.
In the low hours, when the village lay stilled under the pressing shroud of an uncertain dawn, Miss Marple stood quietly beside a warped trapdoor she had been shown only hours earlier, its edges outlined with the faint residue of soot, very old, very settled, and untouched, until now. For years the entrance had been passed off as a disused coal chute. Mrs. Lovell, the widow who ran the shop now, claimed never to have opened it, nor to know what lay beneath. She said this with a smile that didn't quite reach the corners of her eyes, brushing dust from her apron with unnecessary focus. Miss Marple had simply nodded and said nothing. That was often the way, saying less, observing more, and it had served her across many years, many towns, and many hearts that had more to hide than to give. But now there was the matter of the heat. Gentle at first, then undeniable. When Miss Marple had placed her hand atop the iron latch, she recoiled. It had been warm, distinctly so, and that was before the handle began to move on its own. Hours before, it had been Beatrice who'd burst through the parsonage door, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and quiet rage. A second wax figure had been found, this one unmistakably resembling herself, complete with the locket she wore daily, fashioned crudely in red thread around the neck of the effigy. It had been left just outside the chapel's vestry, not 10 feet from where Lydia's own wax form had once been placed behind the altar. Not one villager had seen who'd placed it there. Not a footstep, not a sound. The vicar, already wearied by the burden of ancient parish records and his wife's recent silences, now appeared to age another 5 years in that single morning. His voice shook as he admitted to something he had buried in memory decades ago, an oral tradition passed through the clergy, never written, never taught in seminary, a tale of an outsider, a Romani man whose caravan arrived in the village during the plague years. Superstition ran high then, as fear always does when truth becomes too unbearable to face. Accused of poisoning the wells, of bringing misfortune, and of whispering into the ears of young women who'd grown restless under wartime strain, he was taken by a group of men, 3 to be exact. His name, if ever known, had not survived, but the place of his end had, beneath the candle shop, beneath that trapdoor. Miss Marple pressed lightly on the iron latch now, and though it no longer moved, the warmth remained. It was not the warmth of fire, nor even of the sun's slow return. It was the warmth of breath, of something waiting. She kept her face calm, but her gloved hand trembled slightly. The villagers had spoken in hushed tones, their memories riddled with gaps that did not appear to be natural. Some claimed the man had cursed them before he disappeared. Others said nothing at all, but avoided the road near the candle shop after sundown. There were those, too, who insisted that Lydia had taken an interest in those old stories, not from fear, but from some sense of duty, of restitution, that she had read about the offering not as something sacred, but as something to be broken. In Lydia's journal, hidden behind the lining of her sewing box, there had been an entry so deeply scored into the paper it had torn the page beneath. He wasn't the first, he was the beginning. The fire was theirs, but the curse mine. Beatrice had read it aloud, and when she had, the room had gone impossibly still. Miss Marple descended the stone steps now, slowly, carefully, each footfall echoing faintly as she entered the sub-level chamber beneath the shop. The ceiling was low, the walls surprisingly smooth, and at the centre, blackened, cracked stone, a circle, not drawn, formed, as though something had been burned away. She crouched by it, removed a small brush from her coat pocket, brushed aside the fine dust of wax and years. Beneath, she saw carvings, shallow but precise, interlocking circles,
curved symbols that bore a cryptic similarity to the Candlemas ring she had studied in Lydia's pages. And then, that sound, quiet, repetitive, a sigh, or perhaps a breath. No wind had followed her, no pipes could account for it, no draught, but the breath remained. Marple stood. The pit was sealed with a slab of wood darkened by age and warped by heat. She motioned to the carpenter, old Rick, and the vicar, who had accompanied her with reluctant resolve. They pushed together. The slab groaned as though it hadn't been touched in decades. And then, slowly, it opened. What they found inside was not a body, nor ashes, nor bones. What they found was far more troubling, an emptiness that did not feel empty. The walls of the pit were lined with soot, the stone was cracked, and the ground was... Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet, but her eyes narrowed as she stepped back and murmured one word, Lydia. Miss Marple did not flinch as the slab gave its final creak and lay askew, half off the pit and slanted toward the cracked floor below. The warmth was no longer an implication, it was tangible now, clinging to the skin in a way that suggested presence. The air carried no scent, no smoke, no trace of anything burnt, and yet the stone glowed faintly with a heat that had not died. Something ancient, once buried in rage, had not cooled with time. That was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. The vicar spoke first. His voice was lower than usual, almost apologetic, as if the ground beneath them deserved reverence or atonement. I had hoped it was a myth, he said, a tale meant to frighten children into staying out of the cellar. I never believed they truly lit the fire. Not here, not beneath this place. Marple said nothing. She was watching the space, not the hole itself, but the slight tremble of dust particles that floated up from its rim and dispersed with a strange rhythm, as though exhaled from below. She knelt once more and ran her finger along the edge of the pit's stone lip, noting the change in texture. Watch again. Dripped, no, melted deliberately over the seals, centuries old perhaps, then scratched away by impatient fingers. She remembered the final entry in the girl's journal, how her tone shifted from terror to conviction, from inquiry to action. The offering is not required, it is enforced. That was the phrasing, and following it, that cryptic final line, I will give the fire back what it gave to us. It was Beatrice who broke the silence now, appearing behind them with a lantern in hand. Her face bore a disquiet that seemed to have deepened over the past 24 hours. She had not been sleeping, not truly, ever since the effigy bearing her likeness had appeared. And now there were red marks along her neck, just beneath the collar of her blouse, as though something had been tied there and recently torn away. When Miss Marple noticed, Beatrice looked away. I remembered something, she said. Something my grandmother once whispered to me when I was very small. I thought it was a dream for years, but I don't think it was. Her voice was uneven. She said, the one they burned was only the first, my darling. It is we who carry the fire now. It lives in the daughters. The silence returned then, but not the restful kind, the sort that demanded one listen more closely. That same afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village records once more. The newer pages were of no use, but in the deeper volumes those kept locked in the vicarage cabinet, bound in faded red leather with unnumbered pages, she found a record of a council vote dated 1919, during the height of the influenza epidemic. It had not been a parish matter, it had been classified as extra-ecclesiastical. There were 3 names listed beneath the entry: Marianne Clark, Elizabeth Dorsey, Edith H. Lovell, all women, all members of what was referred to, vaguely as, the Preservation Committee. No official minutes, no explanation, just a footnote. Agreed, the tradition of offering must continue, the covenant remains, and the line holds. The line. Miss Marple whispered it aloud in the vestry as she copied the note onto a slip of parchment. It echoed oddly in the space. Later that evening, back in the parlour of the candle shop, Miss Marple stared into the hearth where the logs had long since burned down to a soft bed of coals. She was not alone. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Ellen Dorsey, sat stiffly across from her, hands folded over one another too neatly, lips pursed into what was meant to be a smile but failed the eyes. You've come to ask me, the woman said flatly. I can't say I'm surprised. I don't often waste time on pleasantries, Miss Marple responded, gently warming her hands by the fire. "But I do find there's a certain value in letting silence speak first." Mrs. Darcy's composure faltered then, just slightly. "I had no part in the choosing," she said. "None of us did. It was decided long before by those who saw further than we could. We were only told to ensure the offering passed, quietly, without resistance, and if there was resistance, the woman didn't answer. Instead, she reached toward the bookcase beside her and pulled a small envelope from between two hymnals. She handed it to Miss Marple without ceremony. Inside was a photograph, aged, fragile, and yellowing around the corners, a gathering of villagers. Candlemas procession, perhaps, taken decades prior. White robes, hands clasped, a narrow circle formed around the chapel's steps. At the very center stood a girl, barefoot, veiled and young, and just behind her, obscured but unmistakable, was another woman, older, dressed in traveling clothes, eyes wide in a moment of realization, not shared by anyone else in the frame. It was Miss Marple, or it should have been. She had no memory of the event, no recollection of having visited the village before this investigation, and yet the resemblance was uncanny. Her fingers tightened slightly around the photograph. "There's one truth left unspoken," she said aloud, "more to the fire than to the others, and it's waiting for her." And in that moment, down in the cellar, though no one was present, the pit exhaled once more, just faintly, just enough to make the old trapdoor quiver. Miss Marple did not sleep that night. She sat upright in her borrowed room above the vicarage, no fire lit, no candle burning, watching the shadows shift on the wall opposite her. And when morning broke over the village with the weightless hush of expectation, she rose, dressed deliberately, and tucked the photograph into her coat pocket. She said nothing to Beatrice, who still slept restlessly in the adjoining room, murmuring Lydia's name in an anxious rhythm that had begun to resemble that disturbing rhyme the children had sung. "Light your flame, say his name, or sleep in dark and wake in shame." There were no children in the streets this morning, only the sound of church bells being wound by hand, and so she returned to the candle shop for the final time. The back cellar, once sealed, now lay open. The trapdoor gaped slightly in the floor like a waiting mouth, edged in soot. Mr. Pike, the candlemaker, had refused to return after their prior discovery. He had locked his front doors, drawn the blinds, and told the vicar he would not go poking into ancestral dirt. There was talk again of curses, and this time even the most rational of villagers kept their lights burning throughout the night. Miss Marple stepped into the pit's edge alone, lamp in hand. The stairs descended further than she'd recalled, each one carved from stone, worn smooth not by nature but use. She counted 12 before reaching the chamber floor, and the air that met her there was warm not from fire, but from something deeper, like the breath of old secrets rising to meet her. The room was circular, scorched walls, low ceiling, faint drippings of wax hanging like icicles from the archways. But the most striking feature was the sigil etched into the ground, a tri-circle interlock, identical to the widowshin ring Lydia had drawn in her diary, and it was fresh. The marks had been scored recently, with precision. There was more. The ashes from some older ritual had been swept aside, replaced by carefully arranged items: a child's hair ribbon, a candle stump, a bone from what may have been a lamb, and in the center, on a pedestal of stone, burned a single candle, tall, blue and weeping blood-red wax. It dripped in slow intervals, each drop falling in near silence, yet with such insistence that one felt it was measuring time, not melting, and beside it, folded neatly, was Lydia's shawl. No blood, no signs of struggle, only a slight warmth still held in the fabric. Miss Marple did not touch it. Instead, she bent low to examine the candle's base. Something caught her eye, a narrow groove beneath the pedestal, leading to the edge of the chamber, disappearing into a vent-like opening. A design of channeling, perhaps, meant to direct the melted wax away from the ritual, but for what purpose? And then, very faintly, from the wall behind her, came the sound. Footsteps, but not from above, from within, measured, wet, bare. She turned slowly. The chamber was empty, yet the sound echoed again, nearer now. Her breath stayed steady, her face unreadable, but her hand reached inside her coat and withdrew the photograph. She unfolded it once more and stared at the figure behind the offering, herself. That same coat, that same pin, no doubt. She looked to the mirror mounted crookedly on the far wall.
Why a mirror had been placed in a space such as this was beyond explanation, and once again for just a moment she saw Lydia there, standing directly behind her, and then, gone, and the flame of the candle shifted blue. She climbed the steps without haste, and when she emerged into the dim light of day, the vicar stood waiting. She tried to undo it, Miss Marple said to him, to break the tradition, but what she found down there was older than a story. It had been fed across generations, and when she stepped into that circle willingly, thinking to end the cycle, she awakened it. The vicar looked grey with worry. But what is it? She paused, watching the shop windows. Whatever it is, it's been handed something it does not wish to give back. She looked down at her sleeve. Red wax. She had not touched the pedestal, and yet it was there, a perfect tear of hardened wax, smeared along the fabric near her wrist. That night, in her room once more, she lit a single candle and placed it near the window, not out of superstition, but observation. She waited long after midnight. The flame flickered, danced, dulled, then brightened once, sharp blue before resuming its yellow hue. The wind outside shifted slightly, and then she heard Beatrice speak from behind the door. "He's awake, Aunt Jane. I saw him in my dream. He's waiting for her." "For whom?" Miss Marple asked, but Beatrice had already turned away. The next morning, the wax effigy of Miss Marple was found on the chapel steps. Melted, yes, but intact at the face. The eyes were open, and the hands held something hidden beneath the folds of wax, a ribbon, Lydia's. The final hour perhaps had begun ticking.
Chapter 10. The Night of Dimming Lights. It began with the candles. Always the candles. Not with a scream nor any alarm. Not even the hurried bang of a closing door. But with the soft extinguishing of flame. One by one. In the vicarage, the dining table bore its usual 2 candelabras, kept for tradition more than necessity. They went out just past 7. In the kitchen of the postmaster's widow, the taper she always placed by the ledger, a habit her late husband taught her, dimmed in silence. In the general store, the oil lamps still glowed, but every wax candle, every ceremonial taper, even those kept behind glass, blinked to nothingness and left no smoke. The sole flame that remained in all of Great Barrow Heath belonged to Lydia. It still stood where Miss Marple had left it, at the stone pedestal in the shop cellar. Steady, unmoving. Its red wax oozing in deliberate rhythm, pooling into the carved groove that ran beneath the stone, down into the unseen dark. But what unnerved her most was not its persistence. It was that, when she returned to see it, it had not burned down even an inch. The same height, the same shimmer, the same unnatural glow. She did not stay long. She had at this point come to understand the mechanics of the story she had been drawn into. It was not about one girl, or one candle, or one family alone. It was a ritual, older than its practitioners had realized, older than their pact, and it had found renewal in Lydia's fear. And now it had taken Beatrice. No sign of struggle, no noise, no departure noticed, only her absence profound, certain, and sharp. The house had been checked, the garden, the chapel, the footprints from her last known presence were already gone. It was as though she had been folded out of the world, and still the candle burned. In her search, Miss Marple returned to Lydia's diary. Its last entries had begun to show an edge, some written in haste, others scratched and rewritten, phrases scored out, replaced, and overwritten again. Most notably, a page that bore the words, "If you see them move in shadow, you're too late," and then a verse she had not shared before. "They come at night, they wear no shoes, they do not speak, but always choose. The girl who looks and does not see, the girl who stands where she should flee." It was the rhyme again, altered, extended. That same rhyme now echoed, inexplicably among the village children, though no one recalled teaching it to them. It was this that gave Miss Marple her final recourse. If the offering had drawn strength from ceremony, performed, perhaps in ignorance, then perhaps a counterpoint could be found within the same language. She recalled the children gathering in the schoolhouse each morning, repeating familiar verses, seasonal chants. Might that rhythm be bent, reworded, used not to beckon but to bind? She gathered them under the old tree near the south path at dusk, a tree known to them for its rope swing and secret carvings, but to her, remembered for something else. It was where the first girl, Lydia's great-grandmother, had last been seen, before she too had vanished on Candlemas Eve. Miss Marple held Lydia's diary in her hands. She read aloud, not the panic-ridden confessions, but the earliest poems, the ones that spoke of light and shame and names unspoken. She bid each child hold a candle, though none were lit, and together they recited, "Hold your wax and say her name. Do not play the offerings game. Speak the truth, deny the call, and shadows cannot make you fall." No adult passed near them during the ritual. But in every window facing that field, it was said later, there was a flicker of motion, a gesture, a form that moved too close to the pane, just briefly, then vanished, and in each of those windows, the glass bore no reflection when viewed from within. Miss Marple felt it too, a subtle shift, as if the village had blinked. When the ritual ended, she bid the children go home. None protested, none laughed. They walked as one, silent, straight-backed, clutching their unlit candles. Only then did she return to the vicarage. Only then did she find the photograph had changed. It was the image of the offering, worn and old, and once believed to show herself in the background, impossibly, but now there were two more figures behind her, indistinct, not yet fully formed, still shifting. One held a hand out, palm open, the other stared, and then the wind rose, not loud, but persistent, and across the village, every mirror turned slightly on its hook, except for Lydia's, still upright on her bedroom wall, tilted neither left nor right. Miss Marple approached it, stared into her own eyes, and in the corner, by the dresser, there was movement. There was no one in the room. She turned, empty. She looked back into the glass and saw a child's handprint appear, pressed from the inside. Miss Marple did not scream. She had never been one for dramatics, even in the most profound of moments. Instead, she stepped backward, not from fear, but from calculation. The kind of movement one makes when something logical has refused to behave logically, and so one must yield to new logic. The handprint in the mirror, pale and misted, did not fade. If anything, it deepened, as if warmth still pressed from the other side. No other marks appeared, no sound. The rest of the room remained utterly still. Lydia's candle, still burning, cast no shadow from where it stood, though it should have. It defied the flame's nature. The laws of wax, of wick, of reflection, all challenged in a single moment, and still the diary lay open to the same rhyme, the same warning. Miss Marple closed it, gently, and crossed the room to the dresser. Her gloved fingers hovered over the glass, then pressed lightly against the same place the handprint had formed. Her skin met only cold, not warmth, not pressure, cold glass, but something in her chest told her it was not empty space beyond. No, it was awareness. Downstairs the floorboards creaked, not once but 3 times. Deliberate, slow, footsteps that did not belong to her own. The parlour had no one. The kitchen door was locked, yet the sound had echoed clearly from the base of the staircase. She descended cautiously, candle in hand, watching as each shadow lengthened toward her rather than away. There was no source for that distortion, no flickering of flame, and yet every surface that should reflect, silver tray, hallway frame, the polished doorknob, now blurred and shimmered with something unspoken, something that watched, and then, without reason or cause, her candle went out, but the air did not cool. A whisper, or the closest thing to it, stirred from the far end of the hallway. Not a word, not a voice, but the ghost of a breath, and with it, a scent, wax and ash, old, burned, remembered. She did not speak, not yet. Instead she turned and returned to the parlour, where Lydia had once played the piano, where Beatrice had sat, eyes full of private questions, and where just that morning Miss Marple had placed a note for the vicar's wife, a note which was no longer there. In its place, a new photograph, undated, faded, 3 figures in a field. Miss Marple at once recognised the centre figure, Lydia, but the girl was younger,
perhaps 8 or 9. On her left, Beatrice, unmistakably older, and to the right, Miss Marple herself, older than she had been when Lydia was a child, dressed in the very clothes she wore that evening. The photograph was not possible, but it existed, and it bore one final element she could not reconcile. In Lydia's hand, clearly visible, unmistakably distinct, a second candle, black, waxy, and unlit. She turned the image over. No writing, only 3 small circles, marked in graphite. The widowsheen ring again. A pact echoed in ink. It was then that the bells rang. Not the chapel bells. No, the school bell. At 10:30 at night. No children would be there. No teacher, and no reason for the bell to be struck. And yet it rang. Twice. She opened the front door and stepped out. Candle still cold, light only from the low moon, and saw something she could not have expected. Every child from the ritual stood silently in the field, each holding a candle, each waiting, and behind them, in the far tree line, a red shape, small, began to glow, a flicker of movement in the shadows. 1 flicker became 2, then 5, then too many to count, all watching, all silent. Miss Marple stepped forward, no longer just an observer. Something was nearing its end, and something else was ready to begin. The field had never been silent like this, not in all the years Miss Marple had walked its edges, nor in the whispered accounts she'd been offered by widows and vicars alike. Yet on this night, the silence pressed not only against the ears, but deeper, as if even the thoughts dared not move too loudly. She counted 13 children. Each stood perfectly still, barefoot, arms relaxed, yet holding a candle in the exact same way, as if taught. And though the wind moved the trees and disturbed the grass, none of their flames flickered. Each burned steady, unwavering, and Lydia's was not among them. Miss Marple stepped forward with care, and the children, without cue or glance, parted, leaving a narrow path toward the low rise behind the schoolhouse. The hill that once marked the old granary foundation, the one the villagers never spoke of, except in passing, and always with eyes lowered. The red shape beyond the trees grew brighter. It did not pulse, nor shift hue, merely increased, as if fed by something unseen. The air smelled faintly of wax and rust. Beatrice was nowhere in sight. The children remained, and Miss Marple followed the path laid before her. As she approached the rise, the ground beneath her feet changed, from dewed grass to hardened clay, then to a strange grit. She paused and lowered her gaze. Wax, melted, cooled, then trampled and dried again. Dozens of footprints, small, adult, barefoot, booted, all interlaced, none leading in one direction. And then, in the center of the clearing, an effigy, not straw, not cloth, but wax, shaped unmistakably into the likeness of Beatrice, face down, partially melted, the back still warm. There was no wick, no label, but in the chest of the figure, embedded, pressed deliberately, a blackened button, from Beatrice's cardigan, the one she'd worn the morning she vanished. Miss Marple did not touch it. Instead, she turned her head slowly toward the shadows beneath the trees, and in the mirror stillness of that moment, they moved. Not creatures, not people, just the shadows themselves, separating from the objects that cast them, tall, then squat, wide, then narrow, as if unsure of the shape they ought to take, watching, waiting. The only sound was the breath of the wind, and the faintest flicker of the wax around her feet, not from flame, but from memory. She knelt beside the effigy, and from her coat, drew Lydia's diary. Its pages fluttered once, as if turned by unseen hands, then settled, near the back, a section she had not yet read, a part added in darker ink, the script more erratic. "He's not a man," the writing began. "He never was. The pact was for peace, but the offering feeds it now. I saw Beatrice in the mirror. She whispered the rhyme. I wrote it down again. If it's said by the innocent, it calls him, but he does not take them, he uses them. Beneath that, the rhyme once more. Light your flame, say his name, or sleep in dark and wake in shame." There were wax drops on the page, old, and next to them, a new line, one she hadn't noticed before. "But if all lights are gone, he walks free." Miss Marple looked up. The hill was empty now. No children, no flame, only one candle still burned, Lydia's, across the field, unmoved by time or gust. and from the woods behind her came the unmistakable sound of a door opening, but there were no buildings left there, no chapel, no shed, no locked room. She turned and saw it, an archway, stone, covered in moss and age, revealed only now, where moments before there had only been brush and soil. It led downward, into the ground, where no pit should be. She stood, and the wax beneath her cracked slightly, as if reacting to her choice, and the rhyme echoed once again, though no mouth moved. Light your flame. She did not finish it. Instead, she stepped forward, past the effigy, past the boundary of the widowshin ring scorched into the earth, and toward the door she should never have found. Chapter 11. The Man Without Flame. It began with a stillness so thorough, it pressed against the senses like wool soaked in water, damp, muffling, resistant to breath or sound. At the heart of that oppressive quiet, Miss Marple stood just beyond the archway of the pit, where warm earth exhaled in slow gusts from a hollow that should have been undisturbed. But warmth implied presence, and presence implied something remained. She did not move, not at first. Behind her, the children, still drowsy from chanting their Candlemas rhyme, sat in a circle beside the chapel's eastern wall, heads tilted, their silence as uncanny as the soft glow still flickering from Lydia's candle, now placed on a bed of salt and ash. The flame danced steady and upright, untouched by the air around it, as if protected by rules no longer governed by nature. Miss Marple's breath drew slow and sharp through her nose, and then faint, just faint. There was a sound from the woods beyond the chapel's fence, not footsteps, no, too fluid for that. It was a glide, a displacement of branches that moved without causing leaves to stir, as if something passed through rather than around. The vicar's voice trembled behind her, just a whisper. We thought it would skip this time. We prayed it would skip her generation, that Lydia was free of the pact. He was not looking at Miss Marple as he spoke. His gaze was fixed on the tree line, where shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the last traces of moonlight. There, at the farthest point the eye could tolerate without inventing form, just at the edge of acceptance, a figure began to emerge. Not from the road, from the woods. It came with the slow rhythm of inevitability, a shape cloaked in layers of waxed cloth, or so it seemed, its outline irregular, and gleaming as if cooled tallow had hardened over skin.
There was no face, only a blank, glistening surface where expression should have been. Its gait was fluid, yet made no sound, and most unsettling of all, it left no footprint in the soil. One of the younger boys, sitting nearest the old chapel gate, gasped and pointed, but no cry followed. His mouth hung open, and his finger trembled, but something within him rejected the act of naming what he saw. Another child took up a strange rhythmic whisper, the rhyme they'd sung in earlier chapters of this strange night. Light your flame, say his name, or sleep in dark and wake in shame. Miss Marple took a single step forward. Though she had encountered deception, betrayal, poisonings, and whispered confessions in stately parlours and market lanes, nothing had prepared her for the psychological weight of a presence that defied alibi, evidence, or motive. This was no suspect. This was consequence. The figure stopped halfway down the narrow stone path. The air between them seemed thinner there, as though reality itself hesitated. It did not speak, but it was, unmistakably, observing. The vicar stepped backward, clutching his collar with both hands now, eyes wide. Miss Marple asked quietly, almost formally, "Do you know him?" And the vicar replied with a confession pulled from the root of something long buried. "My grandfather was the one who sealed the pact. He and 2 others. They made the promise to the flame beneath the chapel. It was wartime, 1918. The children fell ill first. There was panic. They offered something in exchange for protection, a vow, every second generation." He paused, breath shallow, voice barely audible. "We lied to ourselves. We said it was superstition, said it was folklore, just a tale to frighten children. But we kept the rituals, the circles, the songs. We kept them because we feared what might happen if we didn't." Marple's expression did not shift, but her mind catalogued every word, every symbol, every violent reaction that came from secrets exposed too late. She thought of Lydia's diary, of the blood-red wax, of the effigies crafted not by children's hands, but something far older. She thought of the photograph, the one with a young girl who looked exactly like her, though she had never been there. The cloaked figure took another step, and another. Now only paces from the chapel wall, it slowed and tilted its featureless head toward her. In the echoing silence that followed, just as the candle flame beside the children narrowed to a single trembling strand, it spoke. Only one word. Whispered, "Jane." There are certain moments, rarer than thunder in snow, and heavier than silence in a crowded room, when one's name, when spoken aloud, carries the weight of every memory, every misstep, every unspoken truth tied to it. For Miss Jane Marple, the whisper did not echo. It did not need to. It entered her name not through her ears, but through the marrow of her bones. Jane. One word. No inflection, no urgency, only recognition. The faceless figure stood no more than 6 feet from her now. Behind its waxen folds, beneath a surface that reflected no moonlight, but shimmered as if it were sweating candle glow, there was neither rage nor invitation. And yet, its very stillness demanded a response. The vicar had fallen to his knees, clutching the book of Psalms to his chest, whispering lines not in English, but in an old ecclesiastical Latin that hadn't been heard in Candlewick's chapel in over 70 years. The children remained seated, swaying slightly, entranced or compelled, it was impossible to tell. Their eyes no longer blinked, their lips barely moved, and yet the rhyme continued. Say his name, light your flame, or sleep in dark and wake in shame. Only Miss Marple stood between the creature and the chapel wall. She took no steps forward, but neither did she retreat, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as it had always been, unshaken, precise, and devoid of indulgence. You know me. It wasn't a question. The figure tilted its head again, slowly, as if passing something ancient, and then gently, it extended one waxed arm. Beneath the folds of that impossible cloak, the surface of its skin, if it could be called that, glistened and cracked like drying lacquer. No veins, no lines, just the sheen of hardened yellowing wax, embedded with the faintest shapes of pressed flowers and scraps of burned paper, as though history had been melted into its very substance, and in its outstretched palm, a small candle. The wick was intact. The wax was white, clean, unmarked, but around the base, half melted into the form, was something else. String, twine, the very same binding that had been found on the first effigy, Beatrice's likeness, Lydia's too. A pattern, not a red herring, but a clue, a warning, and now, one for her. Miss Marple took the candle in silence. She did not flinch, even though the object was warm to the touch, as though it had just been lifted from fire. The figure did not move again, not a gesture, not a sound. It stood there as if awaiting judgment. Then, from somewhere behind the wall of the chapel, a single bell rang. A church bell, aged and unused, cracked with rust and time, but this sound was not mechanical, it was more biological, a thrum, a pulse, a signal. The figure turned its body, not with haste, not with drama, but with that same unsettling fluidity that marked its arrival, and then it began to move back, step by silent step, into the direction from whence it came. Miss Marple turned to the vicar. You said you hoped it would skip a generation, she said quietly, but that means you knew. You always knew. The vicar, tears streaking his cheeks now, nodded without resistance. I was 10 when they brought me down below the chapel, when they showed me the first offering, an infant girl, barely breathing, swaddled and left with a name carved in wax at her feet. Her name was Elsie, and my father told me she had been chosen. I never forgot it. I never stopped hearing the sound of her cry as they locked the pit. Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The vicar had, all this time, worn the facade of moral duty, but guilt, layered beneath habit and ritual, had shaped every sermon, every hymn, every look he'd cast on Lydia in her final days in the village. And now, with his secrets exposed, the rage within him was no longer directed outward, but inward. A violent reaction was unfolding, slow, private, inescapable. The candle in her hand began to drip. Blood-red wax now streaked the sides, though it had been pristine only moments before. The wax burned, not down from a flame, but up, toward the wick, as if the candle bled in reverse. And then came the whisper again, this time from within the chapel, a voice barely audible over the hiss of wax on stone.
Jane, not once but 3 times. There is a particular kind of silence, the kind that does not fall, but rises. It begins in the soles of one's feet, and ascends, slowly, inexorably, through the spine, curling around the ears like smoke. It is not merely the absence of sound, it is the presence of listening. And in that moment, standing inside the chapel where a girl had once sung, where children had laughed, and where generations had knelt without question, Jane Marple understood that she was not alone, not in the room, not in thought, not in time. The wax still dripped upward, ignoring gravity, burning with a soft heat that did not harm the skin, but left the air heavy with something old, sweet, acrid, and floral. A scent not unfamiliar to those who had once sealed a vow in candlelight. The children had stopped singing. The vicar, still kneeling, now wept openly, and Miss Marple, hand trembling only slightly, walked slowly toward the altar. There, laid out as it had once been on Candlemas Eve, was Lydia's book, the diary. Its cover bore new marks, fresh cuts through the leather spine, as if someone or something had opened it recently with unusual urgency. The ribbon marker had been moved, no longer resting on the final known page about him, but on a new entry, one no one had seen. She opened it, and there, in Lydia's unmistakable hand, written in haste but with clarity, was the following: "He isn't coming for me. He was never meant to. He's searching for the wrong girl." The implication landed like thunder beneath ice. There was no time for disbelief, only calculation. Lydia had learned something before she vanished, something vital, something inverted, and then Marple saw the page opposite, tucked between entries, a photograph, yellowed at the corners but still vivid. It was the original offering ceremony, the ritual, the villagers dressed in robes, the pit behind them, candlelight glowing across faces of young and old, and standing to the side, eyes barely visible under the brim of a wide hat, a girl, unsmiling, familiar, Jane Marple, but it could not be. This photograph was dated 58 years ago. Miss Marple had never been in Candlewick before Lydia's invitation. She would have remembered, and yet there she stood, unmistakably, impossibly beside the offering pit. She stared for a long time, not in disbelief, but in recognition of a twist so deeply buried it had reached across decades, waiting for a moment just like this. The air behind her changed, not movement, not sound, only a sudden awareness. She turned, and there he was, the man without flame. His presence did not ignite fear, it unraveled it, dissolved it into something more intimate, memory. In place of a face, there was smooth, reflecting wax, curved as if shaped by hand, but featureless. His cloak still glistened, and from beneath its folds, a single foot extended, bare, clean and wet. No dirt, no mud, but a smear of what looked like red wax across the ankle. He raised one hand, slowly, no threat, no demand, only a gesture. She was being invited, not coerced, but to what? Her voice barely above breath, she whispered, "Why me?" The answer came, not in words but in sound. The church bell again, 3 times. This time, inside her head, a memory perhaps, or a message. Behind her, the vicar stood, no longer crying, but changed, resigned, and for the first time, he spoke without fear. It was never about sacrifice, he said, it was about passage. We mistook the warning for punishment. Lydia understood. She tried to stop it, and now it must be finished. Jane turned toward the photograph again. The truth was beginning to uncoil. Her image in that photo was not a mistake. It was a clue, a confession, a thread that led back through time and forward to the final hour. And as she stepped forward, toward the waxed figure, he whispered her name once more, Jane, and this time she answered, "I'm ready."
Chapter 12. Down Among the Roots. The candle did not flicker. That alone was strange enough. For every step Miss Marple took down into the cold-breathed hollow beneath the chapel should have invited air that shifted flame, tugged light, swayed shadow, but the flame held still, as if waiting with her, not defiant, simply aware. And so she descended. The trapdoor behind the altar had opened without resistance, though no visible latch had been present. The vicar, now strangely docile and utterly unprotesting, had merely gestured to it, his fingers trembling not from fear but fatigue. He had spoken no further. Whatever confessions remained in his mind had been smothered by years of silence too heavy to lift, even now. Step by step, Miss Marple moved through a shaft of earth-lined descent. The candle she carried, Lydia's candle, still burning with that low, unnerving glow, cast golden halos across stone, root and time. The passage beneath the chapel was narrow, as though nature itself had once tried to close it. Roots had pushed their way through mortar, through brick, through sacred design. A tree's reach inverted. The air did not smell of decay. It smelled preserved, pressed into layers of wax and dirt, like a memory sealed too long in a drawer. There was no sound but the faintest echo of her own footfall, which registered in pairs, each step seeming to summon a twin beat just behind her, though when she turned, she saw nothing. And then the space opened. A low chamber, circular, earthen, with a ceiling unnaturally smooth, not carved, not hollowed, melted. The wax had shaped it. It glistened faintly. There, arranged in a perfect pentagram, stood 5 candles, each one an exact replica of the one she carried, except these were untouched by flame. In their centre, laid with reverence, was Beatrice, alive, still, her body unmoving, but her chest rising slowly, methodically, as though breath belonged to someone else. Her hands rested at her sides, but her fingers twitched every few seconds, like the tail of a cat dreaming beneath moonlight. Her hair had grown since she vanished. It fell around her shoulders now, in tangled spirals, dusted with wax flakes and ash. Miss Marple knelt. There were no restraints, no bruises, no injuries to speak of, and yet Beatrice was as unreachable as if encased in glass. Around her, the chamber pulsed, not with light, but with attention, because along the walls, set into niches dug crudely into the earth, were figures, dozens of them, waxen, life-sized, and wholly still, save for the subtle glimmer of wax that had begun to glisten, ever so slightly, as though stirred by heat. Each figure bore the face of a villager past, some recognizable to Miss Marple from photos Beatrice had shown her, others long forgotten, their expressions frozen in varying states of peace or anguish. Each was an offering. This was not a ritual space, it was a gallery, a vault of silence, a museum of bargains struck. Marple stood slowly, eyes moving across the chamber. She noticed a faint trail of red wax that had pooled beneath each figure's feet. Each pool fed a thin channel in the earth that spiraled inward toward the center, toward Beatrice. The circle wasn't symbolic, it was functional, and still, the flame did not flicker. She walked the outer ring carefully, and as she did, she noticed something else. Each figure was missing one hand, neatly sliced off at the wrist, the wax smoothed over, a detail meant to be overlooked. But Marple had never overlooked a detail. And then, as she came to the 5th candle in the pentagram, it lit itself, silently, without flare. It simply began to glow. One by one the others followed. The pentagram of wax and flame was complete. The heat increased, and from above not a drip, but a rise. Wax began to lift, slow stretching threads pulling upward, defying gravity, reaching toward the ceiling, as if answering a call far beyond the room itself. Marple clutched the candle tighter. Somewhere, behind the walls, something exhaled, and beneath the chamber, roots began to twitch. There was no breeze, yet the wax continued its strange ascent. It rose in filaments no thicker than thread, drawing skyward, as though plucked by unseen fingers. The ceiling above the chamber had once been uneven, a convergence of old stone and root, but now the melting strands sought its center, coalescing toward a small, perfectly circular impression from which no light emerged, only warmth. Miss Marple did not move, not yet. Her eyes, however, observed with precision the rate at which the wax rose, the angle of the figures in their alcoves, the position of Beatrice's body, her breath still slow, still unnaturally metronomic, her skin neither pale nor flushed, but marked by something deeper, a softness not of sleep, but of surrender. Beatrice had not been taken by force. That much was now clear. She had gone,
willingly, or more disturbingly, in belief. At the far edge of the chamber, tucked behind one of the waxen figures, this one, a tall man with the posture of a soldier and a wax-cracked badge still fused to his chest, lay a small crate, half buried. Miss Marple approached it slowly. Her shoes did not echo. The silence in this place was too dense for sound to travel far. She crouched. The crate was simple, handmade, fastened with rusted nails and a brittle leather strap. Upon its lid was a single symbol, scorched into the surface, not carved but branded. A circle intersected by 5 inward lines, perfectly spaced. A pentacle, though unlike any she had seen in the dusty occult volumes of lesser minds. This was older, cruder, and local. With effort, she opened the box. Inside were scraps of parchment, brittle and browned, their edges curled by moisture, handwritten, in ink dark as iron. She lifted one and began to read aloud, though only just above a whisper. To light the 5th, blood must still the flame. To return what was offered, balance must shift. The mouth beneath must open once more, and choose. There were no names, no explanations, only phrases, dozens of them, fragments from an ancient ledger written not to explain, but to warn. At the bottom of the crate, beneath a folded linen cloth now stained a soft brown, she found another candle, unlit, but shaped not into wax alone, but into a face, a woman's, delicately moulded, with careful detail to cheekbone and chin, eyes wide, mouth barely parted. The features were familiar. Marple leaned closer, heart arrested not by fear, but recognition. The waxen face was hers. She did not flinch. Instead, she rose slowly and turned back toward the center of the room, toward Beatrice, who remained unconscious and untouched. The 5 burning candles now cast long lines across the chamber, each flame held unnaturally still. The walls glistened with moisture. From above, the ceiling had begun to sweat. The wax strands thickened, and then a sound. Not loud, not human, but there, a shift, just behind her. She turned, and though nothing moved, one of the wax figures now faced slightly inward. It had not been that way before. She was certain. This one bore the face of a child, a girl, no older than 8. Her waxen arms were extended slightly, and her one remaining hand reached toward the pentagram. Her mouth, unlike the others, had been carved open. Not a smile, not a scream, something else entirely. Marple whispered. The offering was never about sacrifice. It was about reminder. The flame of her own candle grew taller, not wider. The wax did not drip. It climbed the body of the candle in reverse, as though the flame were pulling its own body skyward. Beatrice stirred. One arm moved, slow and weak, like seaweed brushed by current. Her head turned slightly toward the ceiling, lips parting but forming no sound. And from somewhere just beneath the chamber floor, a faint rhythm began. Not footsteps, not quite, but close. A pulse, as if something very old, very still had begun, slowly to wake. It was not a heartbeat. No, it lacked the pattern, the expected rhythm, the rise and return. But it throbbed beneath the soil just the same, with the authority of something ancient reclaiming attention. The air in the chamber had grown thicker, not warmer, not colder, just close. Time did not pass here, it collected. Miss Marple did not speak, not yet. Instead, she set the box gently back where she had found it, pressing the lid closed with great care, as if the lid were a seal, not simply wood. She glanced once more at the wax effigy carved in her own likeness, and placed it unlit beside Lydia's diary, which still hung from her shoulder like a trusted companion. The diary had not opened itself, nor had it moved, but she could feel it warming. She moved toward Beatrice, who now stirred in the light of 5 burning candles, each standing tall, unnaturally straight in their wax beds. The girl's chest rose in that same dream-bound cadence, until it did not. For a single moment, she stopped breathing, and in that moment, the candlelight shuddered. It was not wind, it was not movement. The wax on the ceiling, which had been climbing gently in upward threads, suddenly reversed direction, melted downward like spilled blood meeting gravity again after defying it too long. Each of the wax figures began to glisten, as though some inner heat had awoken them, and then, their expressions did not change, but some, 4, perhaps 5 now had their eyes wide open, waxen, clouded, still blind, but open, and each was looking inward. Marple did not falter. Instead, she knelt beside Beatrice and pressed the warm candle, Lydia's candle, into her open palm. The girl's fingers closed around it instantly, reflexively. Then, Miss Marple spoke the line she had read more than once in Lydia's journal, though never aloud. "Light your flame, say his name, or sleep in dark and wake in shame." A whisper, and then the sixth flame was born. Beatrice's candle ignited, silent and tall. The pentagram was not just complete, it was alive, each point now pulsed with light. And in the center, the wax beneath Beatrice began to boil, softly, rhythmically and without heat. The walls absorbed the glow, and from the stone above roots began to move, not grow, but retract, as though what lay above had decided to release what it had buried long ago. And then, behind Miss Marple, a sound no human throat could make, not a scream, not a growl, but the inhalation of memory. She turned, the figure from the woods, the one without flame, no face, no feet, waxen, cloaked, hollow and quiet. It stood at the edge of the chamber where no entrance had been, as though it had always belonged to this room, simply waiting its moment to reappear. It did not walk forward, it was forward. One moment it stood there, the next, it was beside the pentagram. Beatrice's flame bent toward it, not extinguished, not afraid, but drawn, like the wick knew its opposite had arrived. The figure extended a hand, waxen, translucent, but not toward Beatrice, toward Miss Marple, and from the place where its mouth should have been, came a whisper, not spoken aloud, but delivered inwardly, into the chambers of the mind, bypassing the ears altogether. A single word, return, and the flame of Marple's candle bent, not toward the figure, but toward the ceiling, where the wax now formed a mirror, rippling, reflective, and in that mirror, Miss Marple saw herself, younger, holding the same candle, standing beside a woman with eyes like Beatrice, and a man with no face. Chapter 13, The Smothering. There are moments, fleeting, barely held, that unfasten the seam of time, as if the present forgets its duty, and permits memory, echo, and possibility to gather around the living like breath on glass. And so it was, at precisely the point where the final wax shape began to sag above her, that Miss Marple, standing alone in the chapel pit, with Lydia's blue flame trembling in her hand, ceased to see the world as it was. Instead, she stepped into what had been. The stones beneath her did not vanish, and yet they were no longer stones. They were softer, shrouded in roots, like fingers grown too long in the damp. The air, once still, pressed against her as though carrying the pressure of unspoken things, sorrowed decisions, buried rage, and rituals committed with too much silence and far too little confession. Miss Marple's voice did not cry out, nor did her hand tremble. She simply looked forward, because now, within this unnatural fold of time, Lydia was walking toward her. The girl was younger, not just in face, but in posture, in breath, in the way she clutched the diary tightly to her chest, as if it were both shield and confession. She moved swiftly through a corridor of melting effigies, their waxen faces watching though they had no eyes. One by one, their features distorted in grief, not for themselves but for her, as if they knew. Lydia was barefoot, her footsteps left no echo. The blue candle in Miss Marple's grasp responded with a flicker, catching her cheek just enough to show the tear that rolled soundlessly down it. Not fear, not even resolve, but something deeper, a resignation threaded with guilt, not her own, but inherited, passed down like a locked room key that no one wanted but everyone accepted. She tried to refuse, Miss Marple murmured, her voice spoken only in thought. She knew, long before Beatrice read the diary, long before the children began their rhyme, Lydia knew the truth, and tried to escape it. What followed was not a struggle, it was quieter than that, quieter and far more brutal. The wax figure, the one that had stalked the outer woods, whose form melted yet never vanished, whose footsteps never marked the ground, waited at the end of the corridor. It did not move, it did not reach, it simply stood there, faceless, yet somehow filled with presence, a presence that tugged not at flesh, but at the very notion of choice. Lydia turned, her breath caught, she wanted to run, and yet she didn't. The candle she held slipped from her grasp, and with it, so did time. Miss Marple saw the moment her resolve fractured, not in panic, but in something far more human. Lydia whispered something under her breath, the final entry she had written perhaps. "He's coming for me." But the figure did not approach. No, it welcomed her, arms not extended, yet somehow inviting. A figure made not of rage, but of remembrance, of every injustice forgotten, every secret kept too long. And then, Lydia was no longer there, not taken, not lost, gone. Miss Marple exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, perhaps hours. Her surroundings reasserted themselves, the root-bound walls, the chapel above, the melted figures now forming rivulets around her ankles like candle tears. But the blue flame did not die. She still held it, still, and now, standing at the edge of the ancient stone ring, the woman saw movement behind her, not of shadow, but reflection. In the dripping pool beneath the last effigy, faces surfaced, all girls, all lost, but none decayed, none harmed. Their eyes held memory, yes, but not despair. They were witnesses. They had seen what came for them, and accepted it, or perhaps forgave it. The wax now climbed the walls as if guided by breath, reversing gravity, forming veins across the ceiling in patterns unspoken. Miss Marple's hand tightened around the candle, and then, just for an instant, a cold breath crossed her cheek. Not air, recognition. Someone was standing behind her, but she did not turn, not yet. The blue flame, unwavering, did not flicker in the stale air, as if the very breath of the chamber had been stilled in reverence or dread. Miss Marple, her gloved hand extended, watched the space before her. Yet it was not the present that held her captive. It was the memory now unfolding, not as a thought, but as a sensation. Time, for just a moment, bent like glass under pressure, and then, without warning, she was no longer alone. Around her, without sound or signal, the walls wept wax, thick amber trails sliding down the stone like tears long held in. And in those tears were reflections, indistinct at first, then coalescing with dreadful clarity. A corridor appeared, narrow, familiar, the one leading to Lydia's room. Footsteps echoed, not hers, smaller, swifter, lighter, and frantic. Lydia, Miss Marple could not move. She was in the moment but not of it, an observer entangled by memory, or was it confession? Lydia was whispering, not words, but numbers. 1, then 2, then 4 again, over and over. Her hand grasped something tight against her chest, the blue candle, but not yet lit. She paused at the chapel's oak door, pressed her ear to it. The chanting inside had ceased. The silence inside was watching. Then, suddenly, a voice, not harsh, not loud, but final. "It is time, child." She turned, and froze. There was a shape in the doorway, a tall, wax-shrouded figure, faceless, but not featureless. The very air around it, thickened with old grief, unspoken betrayal, and something else, ancient injustice, wearing the mask of tradition. The diary, that little book in Beatrice's hand, had offered a clue, yes, but not the full confession. What it withheld was motive. What Lydia had resisted was not superstition or myth, but memory, the town's memory, the collective forgetting that bound all guilt to ritual, all remorse to repetition. Lydia had tried to break the pact. That much was now clear. She had attempted to hide the candle, to mask its flame with blue wax dyed from forget-me-nots. But the offering was not only symbolic, it was transactional, and betrayal of the pact came with consequence, or so they believed. She ran, fast, faster than Marple could process, her shadow tearing down the corridor, candle clutched, tears streaking her cheeks, and then she vanished mid-stride. Not taken, not caught, she simply ceased to be. No scream, no struggle. One moment a girl in panic, the next, a vacant space where once footsteps had echoed. Back in the chamber, Miss Marple let out the breath she had not known she was holding. Then she turned, slowly, and found herself no longer facing stone. Before her stood the girls, not one, not three, all of them. Beatrice's eyes, still closed, now twitched in her wax-smeared sleep nearby. Her mouth murmured something, one word, unintelligible, save for the emotion threaded through it. Regret.
perhaps even confession, and around Marple, the silence thickened. The vanished had form. They did not move. They only stared. Some were incomplete, waxen figures, half melted. Others were perfect replications of youth, frozen in final moments. But all of them were watching, not accusing, not even pleading, simply present. In that moment, Marple understood. They had never left, not fully. The offering had not consumed them. It had stored them, in memory, in wax, in tradition. And as her hand quivered, just slightly, above the wick of the blue candle once more, she hesitated. Then, she lit it, and the chamber did not erupt, nor collapse, nor exhale its secrets. No, the wax around the chamber ceiling began to melt, not down, but upward, as if some inverse gravity had been triggered by flame. The pentagram pulsed, once, then twice. The girls did not vanish. They stepped forward, one by one, until the space surrounding Miss Marple grew tighter, closer, and she, composed yet watchful, lifted her chin, and said aloud to no one, or to the chamber itself, "Then let us finish what you began." Shadows twitched. A reaction, subtle, but unmistakable, but no response came, not yet, and as the candle's flame turned a quiet, cerulean blue, its wax unmoving, its wick unconsumed, Miss Marple stood perfectly still, and every statue around her blinked, not with lids, for wax has none, but with presence. It was the unmistakable awareness of being seen, and more than that, remembered. They did not move, they did not speak, but their positions shifted ever so slightly. Where once their heads hung low in waxen despair, they now turned to her as though grateful, or perhaps expectant. The girl nearest, a waxen effigy in a linen school dress from a decade past, had a tear-shaped droplet at her cheek. Yet wax does not weep. Miss Marple, who in youth had walked through bombed churches and broken drawing rooms, who had heard final confessions uttered in gaslight corridors, now stood before a circle of unspoken fates, and found herself the only living soul left to listen. And listen she did. The flame did not flicker, but the shadows danced at its edges. Then softly, subtly, a breath passed through the pit. Not from any mouth. It emerged from the walls, a sigh of stone, cold, ancient, weighted by memory, and brutal in its timing. From it rose a voice, not in sound but in her bones. She did not hear it. It happened within her. They broke the pact, it said, in no language known, and so it began again. The wax on the floor did not drip. It crept, with upward momentum, as if gravity no longer applied in this chamber of old oaths and broken vows. Thin crimson veins of wax rose like vines, ascending the chapel roots that curved around the stone, and just as quickly the chamber showed her Lydia, not the Lydia whose photo was found in the attic, nor the Lydia whose candle had dripped red. This Lydia stood barefoot on the stone, her figure half shadow, half memory. Her gown clung to her like smoke, her voice almost Marple's own. She whispered, "I told them no. I was supposed to refuse. They said I had a choice." But it was not Lydia who appeared broken. It was the space around her. Time cracked like glass. Miss Marple saw two versions of the same room, overlapped, one of this moment, and one of a time lost. One showed her the ritual, a pentagram marked in wax, the girl in the center, the villagers above. The other showed nothing at all, no flame, no chant, just Lydia running through the chapel, running with her arms outstretched, running until she stopped, held by the figure with no face, and then, nothing, no struggle, no sound, no scream. Lydia did not fall, she ceased. Her outline remained for a moment, as if scorched onto the air itself, but when Miss Marple reached for her, she grasped only cold stillness. There was no malice in the act, no rage, no violent reaction, just a haunting absence of one who should have been allowed to stay. The kind of absence that makes the candlelight falter, and it did, and now, every girl was looking again, dozens of eyes, no longer fixed but free. They began to shimmer, their waxen sheen peeling back like stories waiting to be told, and in their gaze was no accusation, only need. Beatrice's body remained still, but her chest began to rise again, shallow, trembling, As if the breath that had left Lydia had found her instead, Marple turned to her, pressed her palm gently over Beatrice's forehead. "You're safe, child," she whispered. "You are not the offering." She was answered not by Beatrice but by the ceiling. The melted wax had reached it, and was forming symbols, familiar to Miss Marple now, the same ones etched in the back of Lydia's diary, the same ones near the altar, the same ones she saw carved faintly on the underside of the old chapel bell, symbols of memory, of pact, of silence. Miss Marple stepped back, lifted the blue candle, and let it breathe. Its light pulsed once, then twice, and with the third it burst upward, into a dome of azure fire that engulfed the root-filled chamber, and in its light, every girl vanished, not melted, not removed, vanished. Only their clothing remained, neatly folded, laid in rings, every name sewn into every collar: Lydia, Eleanor, Ruth, Mary Ann, Phoebe, Edith, each one accounted for, each one freed. Miss Marple stood alone again, candle in hand, the stone floor beneath her cool and solid, the wax symbols gone, and as she turned toward the stairway to ascend, her gaze met the doorway once more, and there, framed in its arch, was the man without flame. He made no move, he offered no threat, he simply stood, his waxen veil motionless, his form indistinct. His silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple, ever unshaken, narrowed her eyes. "Who remembers you?" she asked, not expecting an answer, but in response, but with a sound like extinguished flame. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Up there, the final act awaited.
Chapter 14. The Flame's Price. The silence, once merely oppressive, now bore the weight of a vow remembered. Miss Marple stood motionless, her hands clasped loosely before her, the blue candle flickering in her right, the scent of beeswax thick as memory. Around her, the ancient stone chamber beneath the chapel echoed with neither sound nor presence, and yet she was no longer alone. Beatrice, though faint of breath, stirred at last. Her fingers twitched in slow arcs across the blackened earth, as though reaching not for rescue, but for some fragment of a dream now turning to ash. And still the wax, warm, slow, deliberate, crawled up the walls instead of dripping down, forming delicate roots that threatened to blossom into something far more ancient than any man-made ritual. No voice called out, no figure stepped forward. But Miss Marple understood, as only those who listen rather than speak truly can, that a choice had been presented, and she would have to answer it. Not in protest, not in rage, but in something quieter, older, something deeply tied to the very soil beneath Candlewick. Miss Marple lowered herself beside Beatrice, the blue flame casting long, flickering shadows along the curves of their faces. She pressed one palm against the girl's chest. There was life barely, not unconsciousness, no resistance, as though Beatrice had chosen to remain tethered to that in-between place, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of some pact unspoken. And just beyond them, the circle of wax effigies stared out with eyeless calm. Each small figure bore a subtle distortion, an angle of jaw, a fold of fabric, a lock of hair caught in its sculpting. This was not art, these were likenesses, names whispered through the generations, girls marked not by legacy, but by lineage. Marple leaned closer to one, her eyes narrowing. The markings, lines carved shallowly across the wax torso, formed not decoration but numbers, coordinates. She recognized them, burial plots in the North Field, long since overgrown. Each girl accounted for, save Lydia. The diary had hinted at it, yes, but what lay in its pages had been veiled by a tone of reverence, even affection. Lydia had known, not simply of the ritual, but of its purpose. She had known she was chosen, and yet she had refused. That refusal was written in the torn last page, the ink bleeding into the binding, as if the very words had tried to escape the book. "To remember is to pay," the final line read, "and if no one pays, it collects." It. There was no name, no title, no deity, no apparition catalogued or classified, just it, something the villagers had made, or invited, or perhaps inherited, a consequence more than a creature. Miss Marple rose slowly. Her joints ached, but her mind did not falter. In her youth she had feared many things, but in age she had found clarity, that fear only grows where truth has been buried. And buried it had been, for generations. She turned to the center of the chamber, where the wax had grown into a shape not unlike a chalice, wide at the base, narrowing to a delicate throat, as if inviting an offering, a flame, her own. The logic was not spoken aloud, yet it settled in her chest with the certainty of gravity. The offering, the pact, the endless cycle, it had always been transaction. Someone must carry the memory, someone must pay, and she understood now why Lydia had hesitated, why the wax had resisted her, why the blue candle burned only in Marple's hand, because she was not chosen, she had volunteered, and that, it seemed, made all the difference. She raised the candle, the wax beneath her feet trembled, subtly, like the breath of something vast exhaling beneath the surface. The figures lining the pentagram leaned inward, not physically, but perceptibly, as if watching, waiting. Then a voice, not thunderous, not violent, a whisper, familiar, childlike. Miss Marple. She turned toward the sound. Lydia, or some version of her, pale, translucent, her outline blurred at the edges like a memory half recalled. I didn't want to leave, she said, but I didn't want to stay as them did. Miss Marple stepped forward. What were you meant to become? She asked, her tone even. Lydia's gaze dropped. The final one, she whispered, the flame that burns out the curse. And Beatrice, Marple asked. A pause. She took my place. She thought it would end. Miss Marple's grip tightened on the candle. And did it? The figure gave no answer. Only a single tear formed of wax and rolled down her translucent cheek before vanishing into the black earth. And then came the moment. The wax chalice began to rise, inch by inch, as if drawn toward her hand. The flame on the candle curved inward, bending unnaturally, as though being siphoned. She had a choice. To remember, as the diary said, was to pay. To forget would be to allow the ritual to begin again. Without flinching, she lowered the candle into the wax mouth. There was no flash, no tremor, no violent reaction, only a long, soundless inhalation of heat. And then, stillness. Every candle in the chamber ignited in unison, briefly, like startled birds rising in a flock, before fading just as swiftly, except one. At the edge of the circle, far from the others, a candle remained alight, but it burned not with fire, nor with light. Its wick produced a thin ribbon of shadow, curling upward like smoke, black as pitch, and in the space that should have been warmth, there was cold memory. Marple stepped back, her gaze fixed on the void that flickered in place of flame. The silence was absolute, but it wasn't empty. It was watching. Miss Marple did not flinch as the waxen figure began to shift. She stood perfectly still, her breath measured, her gaze unwavering. The flickering blue light, now reduced to a mere nub, cast elongated shadows across the pit, dancing along the faces of the old wax effigies. Each one bore a blank, frozen gaze. Yet somehow there was something resentful in the stillness. She felt the weight of their silence pressing on her back like dust-laden curtains in a room sealed too long from the world. The figure, taller now, its shoulders draped with melted wax, its faceless head turned slightly toward the flame, took one step forward, and then stopped. Not out of threat, not hesitation, recognition. There is a debt, the voice whispered, not aloud but through some space between thought and echo. It did not move its mouth, if it had one at all, and only memory can pay. Miss Marple held up the candle. Then let it be paid, not in flesh, but in truth. The wax rippled across the figure's surface like water disturbed. For a moment, it looked as if the very skin of it might tear. Then, quite suddenly, it collapsed in on itself. There was no cry, no convulsion, only a soft, slumping wetness, as if the memory itself had given up form. Wax puddled at Marple's feet, in a shape far too human, and in that moment, the chamber groaned. Every candle in the pit flared to life, snapping into flame as though ignited by breath alone. Firelight revealed what the dark had kept hidden, a second ring of figures behind the first, their eyes scratched in, their mouths agape. Some bore garments from a century past, lace and shawls, corduroy and buttons worn smooth by time. Some wore no clothes at all. Wax had formed them entirely. They were all girls, Lydia's lineage, the vanished, those whom the village never spoke of. Each had once been an offering. Marple turned slowly, her gaze falling to the smouldering blue wick still clutched in her palm.
And something deep in the pit's air shifted. The smoke above was not dissipating, it was gathering, curling together into a single unlit candle suspended from the ceiling, its flame black, its base upside down. Marple stared at it, a low thrumming in her ears like the slowing tick of a clock's final hour. For every other candle burned golden, but this one, and only this one, gave off no light, just a smoky void. Then, a sound, a breath, no, a scream, faint, as if heard through fabric, and in the very same instant, the village above erupted in flickers. Windows, porches, street corners, every household candle, every lamp left burning through the night, flared up at once. It was as if the entire hamlet had been set ablaze, not by fire, but by memory, and among them, one candle, on a windowsill of the candle shop to be exact, did not flicker like the rest. It burned unnaturally still, its flame black, yet dancing with intention. Miss Marple looked up toward the ceiling once more. "There is one truth left unspoken," she said to no one in particular, "and it is waiting for me." She turned toward the stairs, the air thick with wax, heat, and time, and Beatrice, freed from her comatose spell, was weeping softly in the shadows behind her. Marple did not speak to the girl yet. That time would come. But first, she would confront the memory that watched from the flame that was not fire. The sound, distant yet unmistakable, coiled through the earth like an old memory being unearthed. Not a cry, not a shriek, a scream, yes, but threaded with a tone unlike any human voice, as if grief itself had remembered its name. And above, on the village hill, candles lit themselves in synchronized, breathless ignition, one by one. Windows, sills, cellar doors and chimney stacks, places even long forgotten now crowned with light. The wick of each flame danced not in celebration, but as if protesting an ancient burden renewed. Mothers in their kitchens dropped plates. Farmers, still tending soil after dusk, turned to find lines of fire lighting the ridge. Children tucked in, stirred in their beds, whispering names they did not know they'd ever heard. Yet one candle, the one set on the threshold of the chapel, the one Marple had never seen lit before, even during services, did not burn in the usual sense. There was no golden flame, no familiar warmth. Instead, the wax had turned jet black, and at its tip emerged a strange void, smoke not grey but darker than any shade of night, not rising but curling inward. Miss Marple, still breathless from her encounter, still caught in the weight of her vow, now stood alone in the chapel. The others, Beatrice, Lydia, the children had vanished the moment the flames erupted, or perhaps not vanished, but pulled inward, into something older than time and colder than fear, and then quite suddenly, silence claimed everything. No birds, no footsteps, not even wind. The chapel doors remained ajar, but nothing stirred them. It was not the silence of peace, but of expectancy. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Marple stepped forward. She had noticed it before, the stone relief carved into the altar's side, always obscured by the priest's linen. But now it was exposed. Wax trails ran from its edges like veins. The image, a girl, hands raised not in praise, but bound, beneath her, roots. Not of trees, but of arms, tangled and reaching, and just above the image, newly revealed as the wax melted in real time, a single word, carved in Latin, Memoneris, remember. Miss Marple exhaled. The offering was never about appeasement. It had always been about memory, about holding on to an injustice so brutal it refused to die in silence, rage preserved in wax, guilt made solid, secrets exposed not to punish, but to ensure they were never forgotten. And with that, the black-flamed candle flickered once, then twice, then held steady, and somewhere beneath her feet, the roots whispered. They remembered. There are mornings that arrive not with light, but with a hush, the kind of hush that does not comfort, but cautions. That Sunday in Muchdarlow was one such morning. No cockerel crowed, no cart turned on gravel, and though the frost had not touched the glass, not one pane rattled in its frame. A stillness, unbroken, pressed in from all sides, as though time itself had paused to question what had just been permitted to pass. The village's candle shop, now charred at its base, and oddly reeking of spent wax despite no signs of fire, stood hollow and mute. Yet within it, Beneath the floorboards, and behind a panelled wall where Miss Marple had last stood, the wax had stopped moving. It had hardened, frozen mid-flow. It had failed to claim her. And then, there was the pit, once an offering site, long sealed by fear, broken open in desperation, and sealed once more. Miss Marple had felt it, as she had drawn Beatrice's limp form from the black-rooted earth with Lydia's breathing body clutched close. The walls themselves had shifted, contracting as if with some brutal final gasp of recognition. The pact, made long before Lydia's birth, had been answered, paid for, and at last closed. But closure, such a word does not belong in Candlemas stories, does it? Because even as she emerged into the daylight, her hands streaked with wax, her breath shallow, her shoes soaked in soil too warm for the season, even then there was a faint flicker she did not trust behind the eyes of the children who watched her return from the chapel ruins, especially the one child whose hand clutched a small brass bell with the word forgive engraved on it, but who never rang it. Lydia and Beatrice, discovered sprawled upon the wooden pews where no one had placed them, were alive, yes, but neither could speak, nor open their eyes, nor hear the name Marple when spoken aloud. Their hands, however, remained tightly clasped together, as if memory alone bound them to this world. The vicar, pale and reduced to a man without pulpit or scripture, refused all comment. He did not attend to the girls. He did not speak to the constable who arrived from Truro. And when asked by a trembling sacristan whether the chapel would resume services by Easter, the man simply whispered, "There will be no more offerings." And so it was Miss Marple, now carrying the diary of Lydia under one arm and the blue candle in a wooden travel case under the other, who returned to her room above the bakery. She had not slept. There had been nothing restful about the night, nor was the morning much kinder. When she closed the door behind her, the entire house seemed to exhale, the kind of long exhale one hears after a guest has outstayed her welcome. Miss Marple, however, was not disturbed by inhospitable walls. She had been inside many such walls, and many such villages, and she knew the tone of guilt when it echoed beneath wooden beams. Still wearing the same coat from the night before, now torn at the cuff and splashed with faint streaks of wax the colour of spoiled cream, she laid the candle on the table, paused, and lifted the lid. It had gone dark, utterly, completely. The flame, that singular blue, impossible flame, had vanished. The wick was intact. The base of the wax was cold. Yet when she looked closer, she noticed a strange outline at the base. Not scorched, no, but marked. A circle, ever so faintly etched in the wax, as though a ring had been pressed there, a ring she had never seen on Lydia's hand. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing aloud. Instead, she reached for her valise. Clothes were neatly packed, gloves folded, passport tucked in her front pocket. The train would depart at noon. She had sent no word to anyone, not to Scotland Yard, not to Miss Bulstrode, and certainly not to the village constable, who had been remarkably absent for the past 2 days, and who would, Miss Marple suspected, never ask any questions he feared might come with answers. As she buttoned the final clasp of her travelling coat, her eyes briefly settled on the mirror. There, behind her reflection, the room stood empty, but the mirror did not lie. It showed a small flame, a flicker blue, and impossibly faint, coming not from the candle on the table, but from her valise. She turned, heart steady, and opened it. Nestled beneath a silk scarf, beside a box of tea sachets, and the telegram she had never responded to, the blue candle had relit. No match, no spark, no breath of wind. It burned, quietly, deliberately, a flame that was not hot, but aware. There was no scent, no crackle, only a blue glow, and the knowing that came with it. And then, from somewhere just beyond the window, just beyond the threshold where the gravel turned to grass, a voice, a child's voice, unmistakable and dispassionate, whispered her name, and Miss Marple, who did not startle easily, did not startle now. She simply lowered the lid, and turned to face the window, and as the early light sifted into the folds of St. Luke's Chapel, filtered now through fractured panes and soot-stained glass, it revealed slowly, deliberately, the lingering disarray of a night that had unfolded outside the bounds of reason or ritual. Lydia lay pale but breathing beside Beatrice, her wrist faintly twitching in sleep. Though whether dream or memory moved her, Miss Marple could not say. The villagers had not yet gathered, nor dared inquire, their silence a sort of pact in itself, whether born of shame, superstition, or that most human of responses, fear cloaked in quiet. Miss Marple did not speak immediately, she only studied the women, and when she moved slowly, discreetly, it was not to rouse them, but to gather the pieces that had scattered throughout this long and winding investigation, for she alone had glimpsed it now with bitter clarity. The truth did not reside in a single name or act, but in layers, pressed like wax upon wax, until even those nearest had forgotten what had once been buried beneath. She stepped into the sacristy, where the vicar, still clutching his torn stole like a man accused, now sat slumped beside an upturned prayer stool, head in hand. His voice, when it came, was dry as kindling. I told myself it was just an old tale, the offering, the pact, that the story of the man who vanished in fire was merely that, a story. He blinked up at her then, tears dry, regret fresh, but someone always remembers. It demands to be passed on. I knew Lydia read the diary. I knew she would try to end it. Miss Marple gave a single nod, though not of forgiveness. The diary was a confession, yes, but not hers. The handwriting changes halfway through. The older pages, they belonged to her grandmother. A long pause followed. Then he whispered, she was one of them. One of the first to light the circle, one of the last to admit it. Marple stepped closer, and Lydia, for all her rage and grief, tried to rewrite it, not with vengeance, but with remembrance. He did not answer. The bell in the tower above, long rusted silent, gave a faint creak in the wind. She took it for agreement. Later that morning, as the sun crept high enough to strike the ash-ringed ground where the pit had stood, now sealed again, not with stone, but with something harder and older, like resin glass long cooled, a quiet hush fell across the village. The children were released from their homes first, walking like those waking from a fever. They passed the chapel one by one, pausing only to peer inside, and one, a girl with a tattered ribbon and chalk-smudged palms, paused longest. Her eyes locked with Miss Marple's for a moment, and then dropped to the old satchel by Marple's feet, where the faintest glow still pulsed from beneath the leather seam. Blue, flickering. She said nothing, yet the girl stepped forward to the candle rack, untouched now for days, and lit a stub of wax from the altar's edge, held it upright with surprising care, and walked from the chapel with the flame still burning. Her back remained straight, her pace slow, as though she knew her small gesture had meaning, even if it wasn't hers to explain. That afternoon, as the village bus coughed into its idling gear, Miss Marple stood beside it, bag in hand, scarf pulled just so beneath her coat, and gave one final glance to the chapel roof, where smoke no longer curled. Then she boarded, and the door hissed shut. In her lap, the satchel shifted, and beneath its worn flap, that same wax candle, Lydia's perhaps, or older still, glowed once more, though now its flame curled inward, black as soot, and shimmered with no heat at all. She said nothing, but her eyes narrowed, not in fear, nor surprise, only quiet understanding. And back in the village, in the dusty little schoolroom once kept locked, a girl drew a portrait in melted wax upon the slate wall, silver hair, wire glasses, and beneath it, "She's next," the child whispered, and so the village exhaled, but not in relief. No, it was not that kind of ending. The sort of silence that followed Candlemas Eve was not the kind that welcomed laughter back into the rafters, or summoned fresh scones in the morning. It was quieter than that, heavier. It was the kind of silence that listened. The children who had once drawn strange shapes in the dirt now sat quietly, their gazes sharper than before, as though they remembered something no adult could explain. Lydia and Beatrice were found beside one another just before dawn, under the old church bell that had not rung since 1919. Unconscious, yes, but breathing, their palms loosely clasped together, covered in flecks of wax as though dusted with snow that had never melted. They would not speak for 3 more days. Miss Marple, dressed in her tweeds and a simple brooch she rarely wore, one shaped like a wax seal, packed her valise with methodical precision, folding each garment as though they too had borne witness to something best left unspoken. Her eyes paused briefly on Lydia's candle, still resting where she had placed it near the hearth. It had not burned out.
In fact, it had changed. The flame no longer danced, it pulsed, a low, slow throb of blue light that seemed to beat like a second heart. She did not touch it. Instead, she turned and closed the latch on her suitcase, not hurried, not delayed, just ready. And then as she reached for her shawl, there was movement, subtle, enough to make the breath pause in her throat and never quite resume. From the corner of the table, where the children's crayon box still lay untouched, a small sheet of paper fluttered down, drawn in wax, blue, red, yellow, and one stark black line forming the border, was a face. Her face, not quite smiling, not quite frowning, somewhere in between, like someone waiting at the edge of a very old promise. She turned the drawing over. There was no signature, only a whisper, not heard, but felt, as if the air had shifted just behind her ear. "She's next," and the blue candle flickered. For the first time, viewers, did you spot the clue in Lydia's diary? Or the whisper from the wax figure back in Chapter 8? What do you think the man without flame truly was? Memory, justice, or punishment, long postponed? Tell us below. Where are you watching from? And what do you believe might finally bring justice to Candlemas? And if you've stayed with Miss Marple through all 15 chapters, you already know, the silence was never empty. It was watching. It always was. If this mystery drew you in like a whisper through keyholes, consider subscribing, not just to follow Miss Marple's final steps, but to stay close to the forgotten corners of stories that never quite rest. Until next time, light your candle, and watch what stares back.